In this part of the course, we're going to continue building the Natures project, but now with the focus on making the web page responsive. So in this section, you're going to learn about some pretty advanced responsive design techniques, like media queries for screen width, resolutions, and different touch capabilities. And also a hugely important topic, which is called responsive images. Plus, you will use feature queries to implement different features for browsers with different capabilities. So overall, the goal I have for this section is to give you the tools to make your websites accessible to every user on every device, screen, and browser. Alright? So once more, this section is full packed with new content, designed to bring you a bit closer to becoming a pro CSS developer, which is the entire goal of this course, right? Two fundamental aspects of modern responsive design are, without a doubt, deciding about going mobile first or desktop first with our website or app, as well as selecting breakpoints for our project when writing media queries. So in this lecture, that's what we're going to talk about. So let's dive right into it. In the desktop first approach, we optimize our interfaces for the large screens, and therefore we start by writing CSS code for these large screens into our CSS file. This is what we've been doing all this time in the Natures project, right? Now later, when we make the website responsive, we simply write media queries in order to shrink the design to fit to smaller screens. This is the more traditional way of doing things, and also the easier way to learn, in my opinion. The way we do this is by writing media queries that test for max width. And if that's confusing to you, no problem, I'm gonna explain that in the next slide. But for now, let's see how the mobile first strategy is different. In mobile first, we start writing CSS code for smaller screens in order to optimize for mobile, and then move up to larger screens from there using media queries. And in this case, we do this by writing media queries that test for min width. So it's basically just the opposite workflow. Now, even bigger than the technical aspects of mobile first is the philosophy that's behind this strategy, which is that we, the designers, really have to think about the mobile experience by reducing our websites or apps to the absolute essentials, stripping away everything that's not really necessary in order to end up with a smaller and faster final product. We're gonna discuss this a bit more in a second, but for now, let's move on to the more technical and more exciting aspects of responsive design. So, since we were talking about desktop and mobile first strategies, this is an excellent time to talk about the difference between the type of media queries that we have to write for each approach: max width for desktop first and min width for mobile first. Maybe you've always been using max width media queries, but without really understanding how they work. And so that's what I want to clear up right now. So as an example, we have here a pixel spectrum going from 0 to infinity, with a couple of breakpoints in them, 600, 900, and 1200 pixels. Let's start with desktop first. And remember that we start by writing CSS for larger screens, and so our initial code is on the right side of this spectrum, right? Now, in order to adapt our designs to smaller screens, we write max width media queries, like this one. So max width 600 pixels. So what this media query does is that it basically checks if the current viewport width is smaller or equal to 600 pixels. And if it is, then all the CSS code that is in this media query will apply. And if not, that specific code will just not apply. So what this means is that the max width is 600 because that is the maximum width at which the media query still works. It still applies. And after that, it stops working. Now in these media queries, what we do is just override some specific parts of the global CSS code, only the parts that we want to change, because all the rest of the global code will of course still apply. So think of media queries as tools to overriding specific parts of our CSS for specific viewport width. Alright, and so the same of course works for the next breakpoint and the next media query, which is max width 900 pixels in this case. So all of the code that is in this query will work as long as the width is less or equal to 900. In other words, as long as the maximum width is 900 pixels. But maybe now you're wondering, what if a phone has a width of 500 pixels? Which media query will apply now? And that's an excellent question, and the answer is pretty simple actually. Both queries will apply, because both conditions are true, right? 500 is less than 600, but also less than 900 pixels, and so the code in both media queries will be applied. Now, if you have conflicting CSS rules in these queries, which is usually the case, like defining the global font size in both media queries, then the one which appears last in the code is the one that takes precedence, just like you learned in a lecture about the cascade. Remember that one? That's because media queries don't add any importance or specificity to our selectors, and so the order of the code matters a lot. And that's why we keep our media queries always at the end. But don't worry if this sounds overwhelming right now, because we're going to apply all of this over the next couple of lectures. And just to complete the example with the last breakpoint, here is how the media query looks like for 1200 pixels. So at 1200 pixels is the width at which we start doing some changes in our media queries. Above 1200 pixels, we have the desktop version of our project, outside of any media queries. Okay, and with this, we have the full picture of this example project with a desktop-first approach. So let's now look at the mobile-first approach, where our initial CSS code is obviously on the left side of the pixel spectrum, where the mobile phone screens are. So where before we had max width media queries, we now have min width queries, like this min width 600 pixels, which basically asks the question, is the current viewport width larger or equal to 600 pixels? If so, then the code applies. So it's called a min width query because 600 pixels is the minimum width at which the media query starts to apply. Now visually speaking, this translates to a pixel range starting from 600 pixels covering all the way until infinity, basically. So all screens with a width larger than 600 pixels will have the code in this media query applied to the page. Make sense? Now we have to use this type of media query in the mobile-first approach because basically we want the queries to stay away from our smaller screen styles. So we want them to work for bigger screens, and so the max width approach we had before wouldn't work. You can see that very nicely with the arrows in the diagram and the pixel range that each query covers. Okay? So again, in mobile first, with our media queries, we want to stay away from the small screen sizes. And so that's why we have to use min width media query types. And so now for the remaining two breakpoints, the logic is pretty much the same as for the desktop first strategy. So for the 900 pixel breakpoint, we have a min width 900 pixel media query, which is activated if the viewport width is larger or equal to 900 pixels, of course. And the same for 1200 pixels. So it's just the same logic as before. Alright, did you get that? Now that we know everything about mobile first and desktop first, let's try to decide what's actually best for you, depending on your unique situation and project, by looking at the pros and cons of mobile first design. So, we already saw that the whole strategy behind mobile first is to narrow down our interfaces, being it websites or apps, to the bare minimum in order to create a small, fast and efficient product completely optimized for mobile users. And this actually makes a ton of sense in a world that's becoming more and more mobile, with a huge part of the internet traffic already coming from mobile. Another big advantage of mobile first is that having all these design constraints on smaller screens, we automatically prioritize content over purely aesthetic design, which also makes sense because I'm sure that you've heard the sentence, content is king, right? However, the problem with this strategy is that we end up with the opposite problem, where the larger desktop version might feel overly empty and simplistic. I mean, why having an advanced system like a huge desktop computer if websites don't even use the device's resources and capabilities, right? Also, if you're like me and more used to see a whole lot of desktop websites, then it may seem a bit weird, even counterintuitive, and also difficult to develop mobile first. That's simply because a larger canvas where you can start designing without so many restrictions will give you much more creative freedom, which is great to set your websites apart from the competition. Plus, if you're developing websites for clients, they usually like to see a desktop version of the site as a prototype, and not just a super stripped down mobile version. So that's also something you have to consider. And finally, users of a particular website in a certain business niche might not even use the mobile internet that much and prefer to use a normal computer to check out websites. We always need to consider the purposes of a website and align it with our users' needs. So this is another question you have to ask yourself when deciding which strategy to choose. Alright, so this might look like there are more cons than pros to mobile first, but it's not that simple, of course. I've seen a lot of designers online saying that they actually don't build mobile first at all. But of course, there are also people building like this. Each project is a project, and in each case, in the end, it's you who has to decide what's best. There's just one important piece of advice that I have to give you, and that I follow myself, which is that no matter what you decide, always keep both the desktop and the mobile versions in mind, and understand that they're both important. You should never design only for one of the solutions and just leave the other one as an afterthought. Alright? Does that make sense? Now about the natives project that we've been working on, you have probably already noticed that we're using a desktop-first approach, simply because I would find it extremely difficult to teach you all the concepts that I've taught you so far on a small screen with all the restrictions that we've been talking about. It just wouldn't be practical at all. And so the media queries we're going to write next are all of the type max width. But that's not a problem at all, because in the last slide, and in this lecture in particular, I've given you everything you need to know to start building mobile first websites for yourself if you think that that's the best strategy for you. It's really not such a big difference, and I do highly encourage you to try it out for yourself. Again, I did it this way in this course because it's just easier to teach and also to learn, in my opinion. But on your next real-life project, you should totally try it out if it makes sense for you. Alright, moving on, we need to also talk about breakpoints. Remember that breakpoints are the viewport width at which we want our design to change, or in other words, where we want to put our media queries. No matter what we decide about going mobile first or desktop first, one thing that is for sure is that we have to select breakpoints for our design. And for me, there are three major ways of doing so: the bad, the good, and the perfect way. Unfortunately, the bad way is also the most used way of choosing breakpoints, and it consists of simply using the width of popular devices as the breakpoints. And designers really like to use Apple products like the iPhone and the iPad to set breakpoints for their screen width. And while this is the easiest way, it has a couple of problems. First, you're optimizing for one very specific device, ignoring all the users of other devices, which may be even more used than the Apple products. And second, and even more important I think, is that this strategy is not future-proof at all. If tomorrow Apple decides to completely change resolutions on all their devices, do you want to go ahead and change all your media queries on all the projects that you've ever built? I don't think so, right? We've been talking a lot about reusable and maintainable code, and using specific devices as breakpoints is completely against all that logic. Now, of course it's okay to use this strategy if you're just starting out with responsive design and just want to learn how it works. But if you want to get more serious, it's time to move on to a better way, which I like to call the good way. In the good way, we look at all the most used device width on the entire internet, try to group them together in a logical way, and then pick our breakpoints from that. And while it's still not ideal to use real devices to figure out breakpoint, it's already a lot better than the first way, because we're using a lot of devices and we're also using the most popular device width. Plus, we're not setting breakpoints at one specific point, but between similar device width. Alright, and now the perfect way to do this is to ignore devices altogether and only look at your content in your design. So ideally it works like this. You begin at one size, either mobile or desktop, and then start increasing your screen width, or decreasing for desktop first. Then, as soon as the design breaks, which means that the design no longer works, it no longer looks okay, then you insert a new breakpoint. And that's it. So again, you just put the breakpoints wherever your design starts to look weird and out of place, and don't think about devices at all. Now the thing is that this approach can be extremely difficult, and that's why not many people are doing it. Without the constraints of at least a couple of predefined breakpoints, it's hard to find the best ones, and not to end up with really a bunch of them. And that's why we're going to use the second method I showed you, which I call the good way. But you should totally try this perfect way in the future, okay? You really should. It's a great exercise to design without the constraints of having predefined breakpoints. Now, with the second approach that I showed you, we start with the most used screen size that we can get from an app called StatCounter. So this data is freely available on the internet. This one is for the range between August 2016 and August 2017. But if you're watching this video in 2018, 2019 or even 2020, these stats will probably not have changed that much. And even if they did, you can just use this strategy with the new screen sizes and select your breakpoints from there. Anyway, in this diagram, I just plotted these most used screen sizes that you can see in the chart down there. So from this, you can already see pretty good how we could group these screen sizes, right? So usually we need one breakpoint for phones, one for portrait tablets, one for landscape tablets, and one for the desktop. There can be more, of course, but these are the basics. So where do you think these breakpoints should be based on this diagram? And here's how I would position them. So the phone ranging from 0 to 600 pixels, from 600 to 900 the portrait tablets, from 900 to 1200 the landscape tablet, and from there it's the desktop. I actually even included a breakpoint for big desktops, starting at 1800 pixels, but that one is not really mandatory. It's just if we want to give users with these huge screens something special. Now this could be different, of course. It's actually a bit subjective, but as long as it makes sense, and it does, I think, then it's great. Now just to give you some perspective, these are the iPhone 8, iPad Portrait and Landscape, and MacBook Pro 15-inch. And yeah, it is totally okay to call this iPhone or iPad or MacBook, and in fact, we can and should use these devices to test our responsive designs. What we should not do though, is to just use their width as breakpoints, but we already talked about that. Alright, and that's it for this lecture. I hope it made a lot of things clearer to you. And now, all we have to do is to actually implement these media queries, so don't wait and come with me straight to the next lecture. See you there. With our responsive breakpoints now defined, let's start to implement them in media queries in our SASS code, so that we can start making the page responsive. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn how to use a powerful SASS mixin to write all our media queries with one single mixin. And in order to do that, you'll learn how to use the content and if SASS directives. And finally, we're going to take advantage of the Chrome DevTools to check out our media queries and responsive designs as we code. So the traditional way that many people, and especially beginners I think, used to write media queries was to simply create another CSS file and then in there simply write a big media query, something like this. So media then max with 600 pixels for example, and then in here we would write our styles like HTML and body, and then all of these other components that we have here. So all of these, for example, we would then copy them and put them here in our huge media query. And we would have one media query per breakpoint basically. But what if there is a better way? What if we could simply add the media query into each of our selector? That would make our life a lot easier, right? So for example, imagine that we want to make our story responsive, for example. Imagine we want to make this one responsive. It would be really useful to simply add a media query, for example, in here, and then do it that way, right? So for example, media query, and then max width 600, like this. And with SASS, we can actually do it this way. Okay, if we would now go ahead and write something in here, for example, with 50% or something like that. And this is just a test, okay? I'm just testing and showing you stuff for now. So if you would write it like this, and then open up our compiled file here, which I think we haven't ever opened up until this point. Okay, so this is our compiled CSS file. All of the CSS that we wrote in the last section is in here. So you wrote an impressive, let's take a look. Wow, all of the CSS code. So you wrote an impressive 765 lines of this compressed CSS code. So this is really a lot. But what I was actually looking for here was the code about the story. So let's take a look where that, here it is. Okay, and here's the code that I just wrote. Okay, and so this is similar to what I showed you in the beginning. So to this one here. So where we have a media query and then in there our selector and then the declaration block, okay? But of course, this here is much simpler because we're not repeating the selector. So we just say that at this max width here, for example, we want the width to change to 50%. Okay, and so that makes it a lot easier. But again, I'm going to delete this now because this was just for testing purposes. So to show you a better way. And so here we could actually do something similar. So something like this. And now instead of repeating the selector here, we could simply go ahead and write font size like 50% or something. Okay, so that would make our life a lot easier. We could then go ahead, write the next one in here. And so in the end, we would end up with a lot of media queries like this. And that's not a problem at all. So having like hundreds of these small media queries or one big one is not really a problem, okay? So don't worry about that one. Now, if you think about it, imagine you would have to write this here, so all of this code here, in all of your selectors. So in all of these files, in all of the elements that you selected and you want to change, you would always have to write this media query. So that would be a lot of work. And even worse, imagine that someday you would decide to just change your breakpoints. So then you would have to go back and change all of these numbers. And so there is an even better way than this. And what we're going to do is to write a mixin. And basically the mixin will do this part here for us. So we'll write a mixin, and that mixin will then paste, basically, will insert this code for us. Okay, so let's try to do that, because that will be the best solution of all. So our mixins file. So this is the clear fix and the absolute centering that we already have. And we're now going to add something like a media query manager. That's how I like to call it. Now, just to recap our last lecture, let's write actually our breakpoints in here. So opening some comments here. So the ranges we just defined in the last lecture were from 0 to 600 pixel, we had the phone, right? Then from 600 to 900, we had the tablet and portrait mode. And this is just so we don't forget it, okay? From 900 to 1200, we had our tablet in landscape. Align this all nicely. And then from, I think from 1800 up, so 1800 plus, we had something for big screens, so big desktop. Right? Now basically everything that's in between here, so from 1200 going to 1800 is where our normal styles apply. Okay, so remember that this is basically a desktop first approach where our normal styles that we have written so far outside of the media queries are for the desktop, right? So basically these are the styles that apply to this 1200 to 1800 pixel range. Okay, and so we're then going to write max width media queries for these three ranges here and a min width media query for this range. And you will see how in a second. Okay, so let's then write a mixin. I'm going to call it respond. And let's say I want one for the phone. Okay, then what I'm going to do is to simply write the media query in here. So max width 600 pixels. And then in here should go, of course, the content. Now, how do we actually do that, right? So how do we know that, for example, that the code that we write here, so let's go back to what we had before. Okay, so how do we actually pass this font size 50% into the mixin? Well, there's something called the content directive. And so it's this one. So the content. And this basically allows us to pass a block of code into a mixin. Okay, so we can now use that mixin, respond phone. Okay, so in here we want respond phone and then a font size of 50%. Okay, and so this here is basically the content that I pass into the mixin. Okay, and here of course I need to include. And all right. So remember that when we first talked about mixins, I sometimes used to pass arguments into it, right? And then I used the parentheses in order to pass a value into a mixin. But this is different. So here we can pass an entire block of code basically into the mixin. Okay, and we can now go ahead and add more lines in here if you wanted. And then all of that content would be called here add content. Okay, so the content we wrote there will then be put in here, and then the mixin will include this entire code here. So this media query already with the content inside. Okay, so let's compile this, and it actually is already compiled. So let's take a look if this here is the same than this, and it should be, right? So let's open this one again. It should be somewhere here near the top. And here we go. So you see, the first media query is this one here, ending here, and then this one here, which is the exact same thing. Okay, does that make sense? Now we can do even better than this. Okay, so I'm going in steps here and showing you the improvements that we do instead of just showing you the final solution. So I think it's more logical for you, and it's better if you really understand where these things come from. Okay, so we have a mixin called respond phone. Then we would have to have a mixin called respond tablet portrait, and then one for respond tablet landscape, and so on and so forth. But that's not what we want. We just want one huge mixin which covers all of these cases. Okay, so how could we do that? Well, that's why I actually called it Media Query Manager, because that's the mixin that we're going to write. So this is the first one, and I'm going to leave it here for now just for testing purposes, and I'm going to create a new one. So mixin, and this one I will just call respond. And then the difference is that into this one we are going to pass a breakpoint. Okay, so a breakpoint in form of a name. Now the names of the breakpoints that I want to pass into here, let's actually write them out here as well. So basically documenting this mix point, and that's a good practice. So breakpoint argument choices. And so the first one I'm simply going to call phone. Then we will have one breakpoint called tab port. Now we could call it tablet portrait, but I don't want to write all that text each time I'm using this mixin. And so I just use a small name, just tab port. Okay, and then tab land for the tablet landscape. And finally, big desktop. So these are the names. All right, and how do we do that now? Well, we already saw the content directive, but there's another directive in SASS that we didn't talk about yet, and that's the if directive. So this is now similar to more advanced programming, And I said that I wouldn't cover the if directive in the course, but actually I need it right now. So what is the if directive? And if you're familiar with some programming language, like JavaScript or something, then you already know what the if statement is. So what an if does is basically it makes a test. And if the result of this test is true, then something happens, okay? But it's easier to actually show it to you in practice. So if the breakpoint is phone, then we want something to happen. And what we want to happen comes here in this curly braces, so in this block here. And that's actually it. So let me recap that. We are going to call this mix in here, we're going to include it, and we will pass a breakpoint. And if that breakpoint that we pass in here is called phone, then what we want to happen is this. And what we want to happen is this exact media query that we had before, right? So for the phone, we have 600 pixels. And so that's the media query that we want to include in that case. Okay, so let's now actually test this as well. And again, I'm going to do it here. So this time it looks a bit different. So include, respond. And now with this argument, I can say that I want a media query for the phone with a font size of 50%. All right, so let's save this and that will compile the code. So let's check it out. And indeed, here it is. So this is the first one and this is the second one, and they are completely identical, so exactly the same, meaning that this actually works. All right, so we now have this mix in which allows us to pass simply the word phone in there, and then it will figure out which media query it will do. Okay, and with that in mind, we can now extend this to all our 4 breakpoints. Right, so we have tab port, we have tab landscape, and we have big desktop. All right, and now these breakpoints here, well, the first one is 600 as we know, so everything from 0 to 600 is for the phone. So max width again asks if the width is less than 600 pixels, right? Remember that from the last lecture? Okay, so for tab port, we then have 900. So for all the width which are less than 900 pixels, okay? Then for the tablet landscapes, we have 1200 pixels, right? So this should apply to all the width that are smaller than 1200, or actually smaller or equal to 1200. And then we have a media query for the big desktop. And when do we want this to happen? Well, we want 1800 plus. So we want this to happen when our width is larger than 1800, right? And so, as we learned in the last lecture, this is a min width media query. So the minimum width at which this will occur is 1800 pixels. And if it's more, then it will happen. And if it's less, then it's not going to happen. Okay? And so that is our media query manager, as I like to call it. Okay? And now just to demonstrate to you that this actually works, let's now include a bunch of these in here. So all of them actually. So we have the phone, we have tablet port, we have tab land, and we have big desktop. Let's just change numbers here, 50, 60, 70, and 80. All right, and so let's check that out again. And indeed, here it is. It's a bit weird with all the spacing, so let's give it some spacing to see it better. But actually, that's what we wrote, okay? So we have a media query just for the HTML with font size 50% for max width 600 pixels. Then we have for 900 pixels with 60%, 1200 pixels 70, and 1800 pixels min width 80%. So that's fantastic. That's a huge step forward over the old way of writing the media queries that I explained to you before. Okay, this is really much better than what we had. Now, just one last thing that I have to change here is actually the pixel unit here. Okay, so we've been talking about pixels here all this time now, but such as in the rest of the page, we're actually not going to use pixels in the media queries here. And that's because if the user changes the default font size in the browser, then the media queries would not be affected by that, right? However, we want them to be affected. So just like before, we use pixels simply to understand what's going on here, but we then use a relative unit that is in the end going to convert to pixel, okay? Now about rems and ems, there's an important particularity about them in media queries. And that's because ems and rems in media queries, they are not affected by our root font size setting, okay? So by this setting here, okay? So they are simply not affected by what we do here in the root font size setting. So what that means is that one rem or one em in a media query is always just equal to the font size which is coming from the browser. And that's by default 16 pixels. But if the user changes it to like 20 pixels, then it will be 20 pixels no matter what we have in our base font definition, okay? Now what we're going to use here is ems and not rems, because rems fail to work as intended in some of the browsers, okay? And so there's been some experiments done by people who understand a lot of all of this. And the conclusion basically is that ems are the best option for media queries, okay? And so that's what we're going to do here. So keeping in mind that one em is 16 pixels, let's now convert all of these here, okay? So basically we say 600 divided by 16, okay? And so we end up with 37.5 em. 37.5 em. But just so we know what it actually is, let's write it here in a comment. So 600 pixels, and the same here, of course, so that when we come here and want to check it out, then we know what we're actually looking at, right? So the same logic with 900, so 56.25 56.25 em, then 1200 divided by 16 is 75, and now finally 1800 divided by 16 is 112.5. Alright, and that's it. So this will be converted to our pixels and will be adapted to the font size that the user set for the browser. So it's a more accessible solution here like this instead of using the pixels. So our mixin or breakpoint manager here is now completed. We can go ahead and delete this one here and here this as well. So just one huge comment here for this entire mixin. Okay, so we can close it and we actually never again have to look at this. Now we're ready to just use it. And let's actually do that for the first time here for the default font size, which translates to 1 rem. And so basically this font size here is what defines the size of our entire layout, right? So remember in the beginning when we first started using rem. Okay, I told you that by using rem, we will make the entire layout of the web page dependent on the font size. And that's a good thing because now in responsive design, we can simply change the font size here, right? And in all of these length, all of these measurements in rem, all of them will scale up or down according to these font size, okay? So that's a huge advantage and time saver. So otherwise, if we had everything in pixels, we would now go ahead and change all of these pixels to smaller numbers. But with this trick, we simply need to increase or decrease the font size here, and then the design will basically shrink. That will of course not be enough to make the page responsive, so there's a lot of stuff we will have to adjust later on, but it's a huge step already and a huge time saver. Okay, so let's now define some font sizes for these 4 media queries. So for these 4 breakpoints. So at the default viewport width, 1 rem is of course 10 pixels, right? So 1 rem equals 10 pixels, right? That's a calculation we've been doing right in the beginning, where we set that the 10 pixels that we want divided by the default 16 pixels equals 62.5%. So remember that part? So let's now change all of that in the media queries. So imagine that for the landscape tablet, I want 1 rem to be 8. And so 1 rem should be 8 pixels, meaning that I have to do 8 by 16, which is 50%. Okay? So I'm going from 65% to 50%, and then just like that, 1 rem is no longer 10 pixels, but 8 pixels. Okay, And if I then take a look at something here, like maybe this button here, so we have a padding of 4 RAM here, which used to be 40 pixels at our default size, but then at a tablet, it will simply become 4 times 8. So 4 times 8 is 32 pixels, and no longer 40. And so everything will decrease as a result of this. Okay? So maybe here in the portrait, I want one RAM to be 9 pixels. Okay, and well, actually that doesn't make much sense because the landscape here is bigger, and so the font size should be bigger here. So let's actually put this one here. So this is where we want 50%, and here I want it to be 9 pixels, so 9 divided by 16, and that's 56.25%. So 56.25%. Okay, and then when we have a really big screen, maybe I want one RAM to be equal to 12 pixels. So scaling the entire design up. And so now we do 12 by 16. So 12 by 16, and that's 75%. And so I'm now increasing my entire design. Okay, now here about the phone. Remember that this media query asks the question if the width is smaller than 600, right? But this next media query here asks the question if the width is lower than 900. And so imagine that the width is 500, and so it would still be less than 900, right? So 500 is still less than 600, but of course also less than 900. And so both of these media queries would apply. And what that means is that I don't really need this one, right? So if I have 50% in this one and in this one, so if they're the same, I don't need this one because they will both apply. And so one of them is unnecessary, right? So let's simply remove the first one, and that should now work as intended. So let's take a look again at the compiled code here. And yep, here we go. So the portrait tablet, the landscape tablet, and the big desktop. All right. And now it's finally time to take a look at this in our final web page. Okay. And so what we're going to do is to actually use the DevTools here instead of resizing the screen, which isn't the best practice, I would say. So we have something here which is called the toggle device toolbar. And if we click this, then we basically get this responsive screen here. We decrease this down here. Okay, and so we can do it here right inside of these DevTools here. Okay. So let's now really decrease and take a look at what we have here. Oh, you saw that? Here, take a look. Here is the 1200 breakpoint. And as I'm decreasing it now, you see everything decreased a bit, right? So that's great. So it means it's working. And let's now get a bit closer to the next one, which is 900. Well, this time nothing happened. Well, why is that? Let's take a look here. And I see that we have now two conflicting media queries here, right? And the one that applies is the 75%. And so, of course, I did it wrong here. Okay, it should be the other way around, right? Because it's the same logic as I explained before. So each time that the tablet portrait media queries apply, the tablet landscape does as well. And so both of them here apply, so these two, and then the last one will be used, right? But that's not what I want. So I just need to put them the other way around, right? And so this one here now asks width less than 900. And remember, this one here asks width less than 600. And now imagine that we have a 500 pixels viewport width. So the first one here would apply, and of course the second one would apply as well. So they would still be conflicting, but the difference is that the smaller media query, so the one for the tablet portrait, is the one that is applying. And that is exactly what I want when the screen is just 500 pixels, right? I don't want the larger media query to apply, but the smaller one. And so this is the order in which we have to put the media queries. Always the larger ones before the smaller ones. And so this will bring me the behavior that I expected. And so Yeah, so now you see the change here and here as well. So 50% is now the current font size. And so you see that this is already working quite well, right? So as we decrease the screen, this keeps decreasing here as well. We can actually put the other one here as well for the phone, just to show it to you. So let me just copy this one here, include phone. So let's put it like really small, like just 30%, okay, which will equal to 0.3 times 16, so 4.8 pixels. Basically 1 rem will be 4.8. That's not what we want, of course, and so I'm going to delete it in a second, but just to exemplify this here, okay, so reload everything, and now as we approach 600, you see that everything becomes really small now. So you see, even the button, of course, will reduce its size, right? Okay, so we made everything work. We made this a very nice breakpoint manager, and we also used it for the first time. So that's great. Let's get rid of this one here. And here, of course, this is not right. It's 900 and 1200. But that doesn't change the functionality, obviously. So now after this lecture, I want you to think about this a little bit, to think about why we had to use this order of the media queries and not the other one around. Okay, so I want you to really get a grasp for this material so that we can then move on and really use it here on the rest of the page. Okay, so please go ahead and do that right now, and I'll see you next time. Welcome back. Now that we have a working media query manager that we did in the last lecture, let's now finally start using it and write some real media queries for our page. But before we start doing that, I want to actually take a minute and come back to the order of the media queries that we write here, okay? So I want to recap on why this is the order and not the other way around, okay? Because this is really essential in understanding responsive web design, okay? So imagine that we have a width of 700 pixels for the screen, okay? So in this case, of course, both of these media queries will apply, right? So 700 is less than 1200 and also less than 900. And what happens then? Well, since both of the media queries apply, it will simply be the last declaration that is applied. So both of these have a font size declaration, right? And so the last one of these two is the one that will be applied, so 50%. And that is, of course, the one we want, because 900 is the one that's closer to this 700. If it was the other way around, like this, then at this screen size of 700, we would have the font size of 56%, which was actually only supposed to be used in the range between 900 and 1200, right? And so if we did it like this, this would mess up our entire code or entire structure of our media queries, okay? And so this is the way that we want it. Now, if you happen to be writing a mobile-first website, then it's a complete other way around. So in that case, we have to start with the lower width and move up to the larger width, because everything is the other way around. We have min-width media queries, and so then in that case, we also need to change the order, starting with the lower ones and then move on to the larger screen sizes, okay? So now that we have that out of the way, let's move on and start writing our media queries. And this is the order in which I like to do it. Okay, let me actually write it down for you, and I will do it here in this mixin. So the order in which I like to do this is to start with the base and the typography, then moving on to the more general layout, like header, footer, navigation, and all that stuff. So general layout, and also the grid. Okay, so the grid also needs to be changed. Then the more specific page layout, and then finally changing the components. Okay, and so in this lecture, we will take care of this part. We're going to change some stuff in the base, in the typography, general layout, and grid. And actually, we don't need that many changes because once again, this overall font size here takes care of most of the changes that we want to make actually. And so the adjustments that we need to do are pretty minor in most of the cases. Okay, let's fire up our typography file here, and then close all of this here, and I'll take a look at our web page. So this is it, still here in the device menu, okay? Now there's something really cool that we can do, what I didn't show you in the last lecture, which is to show actually our media queries. Okay, so these are our media queries. These ranges here. So 56.25 is the smallest one. Let me check that out for you. So where is this mixing? So 56.25 is here. So let me zoom that out a bit. So 75. Okay, and so in here we are now in the 56.25 media queries. And actually we have a smaller one, which is this one, but we don't really have one on the page at this point already, okay, because the only 3 media queries that we wrote were the 3 here, and the one for the phone is not here. And so DevTools, of course, cannot know that we actually planned for one for the phone. And so it's gonna come up here later, okay? But anyway, this one here is our breakpoint at 900 pixels, as you can see in here. And then you can also nicely see which one is applying. So when they become darker, means that they are applied. Then you have this one here as well, and all you need to do is to click here and it goes to the breakpoint. Okay, and also you see here that the blue ones are the max width media queries, and then here the orange ones are the min width. Okay, so Google Chrome also does this nice distinction here for us. Okay, then up here we have simply the responsive way, where we can decrease and increase or screen here as we wish, as I showed you. Then we also have a list of devices here, basically where we can test. So like the iPhone or iPhone 5 or the Nexus or whatever. Okay, but we're mostly going to use here our responsive. So we were talking about typography. And what do we have in the typography? Well, we have the primary heading, we have secondary heading, tertiary heading, and paragraph. So let's now take a look at what happens with these as we decrease our page. Okay, so you see that they nicely adapt actually, and they still adapt in here. And only down here, almost at 600, is where it starts making some problems. So imagine that we had a device with 300, let's say, and then we would no longer see the text here at all, right? So we have to fix that. And another thing that I want to fix is to actually get rid of this white border here on a smaller screen size, okay? And we can do that, I think, here at 900 pixels. So basically at the tablet portrait mode, okay? So starting from here, let's get rid of this white border now. So that is actually in base, I think. And actually it's, well, it should be, but it's not. So let's actually copy this one here to base, because there should be, yeah, there's one for the body. And this is where it should be. This has nothing to do with typography. And all right, so let's now actually include our media query here. I will just copy it from here. I'm lazy and I don't like to type so much. So just copy this here. And now let's get rid of this padding. 0. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's reload. I'm not sure if it did reload automatically. And so here goes the padding, right? So right here at this breakpoint, now it's gone. And as soon as we increase it, then of course it comes back. So that's the media query already doing its work. Great. So, but what we're doing here before was to actually decrease this entire text here, starting at 600 pixels. So basically our phone media query. So let's do that. So typography and heading primary, and I'm putting it right here. So include, respond, phone, and what do we want to happen here? Well, I think what we should do here is to actually get rid of all this letter spacing. And now I see that actually this should probably be in here, right? Because this is where the font size is actually defined and the letter spacing. So let's get rid of the letter spacing, at least in part. So we had 3.5 rem, let's put it back to 1 rem, and then the font size, let's decrease it to 6 rem. Well, 6 would be the same, so 5 rem. Okay, And then down here, let's do the same. Decrease the letter spacing. Well, not to 0, but maybe to 5 pixels. So 0.5 rem, for example. So let's take a look at that. And yeah, so that looks a bit more natural now. And yeah, now actually you already now have this last media query that we were missing, but now we have one in our actual code, and then here it appears. Okay, so that looks better now. But what about our H2s? So, well, I think they're probably a bit too big here at this point, right? So basically we should probably change them at the 900 pixel media query. So tablet portrait. So let's do that. So heading secondary, include, respond, and we called it tab port. Okay, so let's decrease the font size to like 2.5 maybe. And then for the phone we can make it even smaller. 2.5 like this, and then one for the phone. And remember, the phone is smaller, so it comes after the tablet. Okay, so phone, and then let's say 2 RAM. Okay, let's check it out. And yeah, that looks probably better. Okay, so we're not seeing it here on real devices, but for now it's okay to do it like this. So usually I always change everything here in the browser, and then I start testing on real devices. And from there, I usually always see some stuff that I have to change afterwards. But the essential thing, so the first and major changes, they can be done here in the browser without any problem usually. Okay. All right. And I think that for the H1 and H2, this is actually already change enough. Okay. Maybe it's even a bit too small. I'm not really sure. So let's put it to 3 and then 2.5 or something. So 3 and 2.5. So that should be better. All right. And with that, we actually already finished the part about the typography and the base settings. Okay. So animations here, they don't need any changes. Utilities also don't need any changes, at least for now. Maybe we'll change something here a bit later, but for now we're good to go here in this folder. Then here in the abstracts folder, there are also no changes. And so now let's move on to the layout. And I'm going to start with the grid actually. So closing the typography, closing the mixins here as well. And so I'm going to start with the grid. So let's take a look at what happens with the grid. So where do we have one of them? So this is a grid with 4 columns in it. And you see that they're becoming really small, right? So really, really small. And it doesn't look like good at all. The same thing here. And where else do we have? I don't think there's any more than this. Here also too. But here it's no problem. But here and here it's definitely not okay like this. So let's go to our breakpoint. And I think where we should change it is here at 900. Okay. So here it's still kind of okay. And we can later make some adjustments here to this. Okay. So right now it's still okay. But below this, these columns, they are definitely too narrow. Okay. So we can't wait until the next breakpoint, which would be this one. So we cannot have them looking like this. All right. So we have to change the grid system right here at the tablet portrait breakpoint. Okay. All right. And what are we going to do in order to fix this? Well, we're simply going to set the width of all the columns to 100%. That's the easiest way to do it. And that's what's usually done on mobile devices. So all the columns are basically transformed into rows. So the entire mobile web page will have only one single column basically. So include, respond, tab, port. So all of the columns should have a width of 100%. And I'm going to set it to important actually, because I want to make really sure that these widths here are overwritten. Okay. Now the next thing that I have to do is to then of course remove any margin from these columns. Because right now they all have this gutter here, but since they are no longer side by side now, we don't need any gutter, right? So margin right, 0. Very simple. Next up, what we should probably change is this gutter here, okay? So let's open up the variables. So this gutter is an 80 pixels or 8 rem, because 80 pixels is no longer accurate on these lower media queries, right? So we have 8 rem here, but that's way too much, I believe. And so let's create a new variable here called gutter vertical for 6 rem called small. So gutter vertical small, okay? So where is that? And yeah, here we go. So again, I'm gonna copy this, and where is it? Okay, right here. Now this is starting to look a bit confusing, I know. But I think that's okay, given how much writing our code in this way here, which may look a bit strange, improves our lives over just writing original vanilla CSS code. Okay, so even if it looks a bit strange with all this nesting going on, then these includes and all of that going on, you will see that you will become used to it. And yeah, so it's not really a problem. So gutter vertical small here, just to confirm that the name is right. And then let's take a look at it actually. Well, that doesn't look so good for now, but that's because these images here are huge and overlapping, and we're gonna fix that later. So one column, next column, next column. But of course, this is not ideal at all, because we probably want some margin here between these columns now, right? Because the columns, they are basically now no longer columns, but just like sub rows, okay? So each of these here should probably have a margin at the bottom. Now, I also have some space here on the right side, and I'm not really sure why that is happening. So let's take a look at that. And it's because of the row, but I'm not sure what's going on. Let's take a look. Oh, the row has a margin right of 6 rem. Why is that? Of course, this should be margin bottom, not margin right. So margin bottom, we had it here, and then we changed it with the media query, right? Okay, what I was saying is that here, the columns, they no longer should have a margin right. Okay, so we changed that, but they should have a margin at the bottom. And I would say it would make sense to make it gutter vertical small as well, because now it's actually vertically aligned and no longer horizontal. So let's take a look at that now. And while it doesn't look ideal for now, because this is way too wide, of course, the row and the columns itself, they look better now than they did before, okay? And the same thing here, of course. So we now have to change some more here about the row, but the distance between them, it looks okay for now. So what we should do here is to also change this max width here, okay? So right now the row is occupying 100% of the available width, because the viewport is smaller than the grid width, which is, as you see, 114 rem. And so what max width does is that if the width is lower than the grid width, then it will simply occupy 100% of its available width. But we should now actually change that to a smaller value. Okay, and let's put it to something like 50 rem or something. So max width 50 rem, and that will probably fix this problem. Yeah, so that looks a lot more natural now. All right. So that looks kind of good already. Not perfect, of course, but acceptable. So let's take a look at how this will look on an iPad, for example. Okay. So here is a problem, of course, but we're going to fix this one when we start looking at the individual components. Okay. So right now we're still talking about the width and the overall layout of the page. Okay. But this looks okay. So I think for the grid, we're good to go for now. And the smaller minor things, we're going to fix them later down the road. Okay, so next up, let's talk about the header. And well, the only thing that I see really happening here is maybe this line here. It's becoming way too steep. Okay, so in comparison to this one here, which has this slope, then this one here has a really higher slope, and it doesn't look really good anymore. So this was the initial look we were looking for, right? So something like this. But now as we really decrease the screen, especially moving on here to the mobile screen, then it starts looking a bit weird, right? So let's change that now for the phone only. So closing the grid here and moving on to the header. So right here. So include, respond, phone. And then, so what we have to change is these clip paths here. I'm going to change them to 90 VH, and that will probably fix that problem. And so here we go. Well, maybe 90 is even a bit too much. Let's put it to 85. The same thing here as well. And yeah, so that looks pretty good. Okay. So at 620, it's like this, and then bam, there it goes. Next media query, and our change is there, right? Now another thing that we should probably change is this navigation here. It looks a bit too much now here, moving into the center of the stage. Okay, so let's put it a bit more here up in the corner in order to make it look more similar here to this image. Okay, so let's do that and open the navigation. So what we have to change here is the button. So include, respond, and then let's actually take a look at where we want to change this. And I think it starts appearing even before. Yeah, so I think we should already start it here closer to the 900 pixel media query, okay? Because it starts looking off already here at this point. So tablet port. So we have 6 RAM here for both the top and the right. So let's decrease that by 2 and put it to 4 in these two. And then the same thing here for the background. Okay, so, well, I don't know what this is doing here, so let's remove it. Okay, also decreasing it by 2 makes it 4.5 and 4.5. So sorry, double cursors here, 0.5 on both. Taking a look. Oh yeah, so that's much better. And for the phone, it's good as well. So we don't need a new media query here. Well, actually, we could do a new media query. Why not? Let's take a look at how it will look at an iPhone 5, for example. And for now, maybe just ignore that this is happening here. I'm not really sure why. I mean, this white space here, okay. And well, it looks like it's because of this element here probably moving out of the page. And so this is why this weird white stripe here is happening on the side. But anyway, we can see that this is quite not really good on the phone. So let's simply add another query for the phone here. And let's say 3, 3. And then the same thing over here. And so yeah, now we're good. Okay, we have to change it to responsive, and then we can click here in order to move across our viewports. So the navigation looks better now. Actually, let's open it. And as you can see, it looks pretty good without even changing a thing, even on these smaller sizes, okay? So everything's fine, everything's good. The header looks good as well now. And so now let's take a look at the footer, which is the final layout part which we have here. And so we see now that probably we should make these 100% as well, such as the columns, and then probably center all of this on the page. And we can decrease the space here as well a little bit, and maybe even this padding. And yeah, so there's a couple of things to change here. And so let's do that. So the first thing that we want to change is the padding, as I was saying. So include, respond, and I'm going to make it for the tablet in portrait again. So you see that this is probably the most important breakpoint we've been working on, along with the phone actually. So the tablet in the landscape is not really such an important breakpoint from my experience. The most important one is the tablet in portrait, so 900 pixels, and the phone at 600 pixels. For the tablet in landscape mode, well, the most important change, we already did it by doing this. So in here we basically decreased the entire page. We zoomed it down, and that was already enough to make it looking good for width up until 1200 pixels. So between 900 and 1200. Now, let's change the padding here then to a bit like 8 rem and 0, for example. Then what we should change next is the navigation. Okay, because remember, let's just take a look at the HTML so that we're on the same page here. So the footer navigation and the footer copyright are these two elements that are basically side by side. So these are the ones we should manipulate right now. Okay, so let's say we want a width of 100% on this one and a text align set to center. So let's see what that looks like. And yeah, that's much better already, but still not quite what we want because this line should probably not go all the way until here. Okay, but let's take care of that in a second. For now, let's change this one here as well. So that is the copyright. So we also want the width to be 80%, and then we don't want any float here. So float, none, right? Okay, and that looks better, but it's again still not perfect. And that is because there's one thing that we should do and we haven't done up until this point, which is basically setting a padding for the row. Because remember, these two are in a row, right? So these two are the columns, and they are inside of this row. And this row here, it has a width of 50 rem. And so that's probably way more than the width here at this viewport size. Okay, and that's why we're simply having 100% of the width. And we can also observe the same thing going on in here, right? So we should probably have some padding on this width, on the row. So a padding on the row is what we should have, right? So on the left and on the right side. So let's go back to the grid, and you'll see that this is going a bit back and forth between different stuff, but well, that's just how it goes, okay? So writing media queries is maybe not the most fun thing to do, but we still have to do it, of course. It is not so bad in my opinion, actually. So we were saying that we want a padding on the row, and so this here is the place where we should do it, right? So padding, top and bottom is 0, but we want it on the sides. So let's put like some 3 rams here, and take a look at that. And all right, so that's better, right? That's much better actually. Well, something weird. Yeah, okay. So we have this scrolling going on still. So the page is right now larger than the screen, and so there's something that we will have to fix a bit later once again. For now, let's just continue with our media queries and then see what's happening a bit later. And so we will do that in the next lecture, so stay tuned. Let's continue writing our media queries right now in this video. So remember from the last video where I had this weird thing going on at the very end of the video where I could scroll like to the sides here? Well, it turns out that it had nothing to do with the media queries, but it was a bug here in the DevTools. So all I had to do was to click here to go back to the normal state and then click it again, and then everything was back to normal, okay? So maybe that happens to you also, and so that is the fix. So just toggle this, remove the state, and then come back. Okay, so that fixed it for me. It had nothing to do with the media queries. All right, and actually we had not yet finished the footer here. We wanted to decrease the space here, right? So let's quickly do that here in the footer. So it was here at the logo box. So the margin bottom, let's set it to like 4 rem only. That should be enough, why not? Okay, maybe 6, and but then we're good to go. So save, close, and let's now move on. So we took care of all of these now, of all of these 4 layout components. So let's now take care of the page itself. So let's take a look actually before we do anything. So that looks good now. And now let's see. So I think we have way too much space here in general, okay? So this is too much space. This is too much. This is too much. And so all of these sections, they have too much padding, okay? Let me see where that starts. And yeah, I think already here at the 900 pixel, so at the tablet portrait mode, it already starts to have too much padding. Okay, and so let's actually remove at least part of that. Okay, so include, respond, and tap port. So the section about has 25 RAM. So let's decrease that to 20. Okay. And yeah, that's better, okay? And the same thing here, okay? It's definitely better as well. And I see we also have too much space here. So this one here is definitely too much space as well. But let's take care of that later. Let's continue for now with the layout of the page. So we removed 5 RAM from that padding. And so let's probably do the same thing here in the features. So 15 in here. Then section tours 25, 15. And this is different. So this one is much larger than this one, simply because of the fact that we have this non-rectangular shape here, okay? And so we have to give it a bit more space in order to look more natural. So let's copy this one and then remove 5 on each side, such as we did before. Okay. Let's copy it again. Section stories. Okay. So 10 RAM and 0. And the same thing here on this one. Well, it actually doesn't have... okay, sorry. So this is not of the sections. This is already part of the booking, okay? So let's leave that one for later. Let's take a look now. And so we definitely have a decreased space now, and it looks better than before. We could probably decrease it even a bit more for the mobile, okay? But, well, we can leave it as well. So 900 is this here. Looks okay on a tablet. Let's take a look, for example, at the iPad. And that looks acceptable for me. Now, iPhone 6, for example. And looks okay to me as well. Now remember what I told you before, we have to test this on real devices so we have a real impression of what stuff looks like. But obviously in this course we cannot do that, but you should definitely try it when you build your own sites. Now as I was telling, let's decrease the space here that we have there. So what's causing this is the... let me show it to you. It's this class, and it's even more down. So it's this margin bottom pick. Okay, and it's one of the utilities. And so, of course, we can add media queries here as well. So 8 RAM currently, so let's change that. Let's put like 5 RAM or something like that. Okay, and now since we're at that, let's do the same thing here for the medium one, okay? So let's put like 3 RAM in here. And since these have importance, I'm gonna put it here as well. And yeah, okay, it's better now. It's definitely better this way, right? Okay, so for the layout, that's it. Right? It looks acceptable, as I was saying. And of course, this is far from perfect because I'm not really 100% optimizing this web page here because it's not a project that is going to a real client. So if you want this to be 100% real for yourself, then you should probably go ahead and tweak this even more and test the hell out of it so that it becomes really polished. But I am here just fixing the major problems, okay? And well, the major problem that I see here next is this one, okay? So let's now move on to the next component. Actually, it's the first component that we're working on, and that is called the composition. Okay, and here we have to do some real major changes. Okay, and let me actually show you how I want this to look in the final version. So let's do something like this. Okay, so we have basically the images side by side. This one here is a bit bigger than the other two, so it's like scaled and looking as if it was on the top, but they are now like configured in a slightly different way than they were before, so that they don't occupy so much space. So let's do that. And we need to make a lot of changes here. So starting with the photo, of course, because that's where the image itself is. So include, respond, and let's actually see where this starts to look really bad like this. And we see, okay, that it's happening again at the 900 pixel range here. So at the tablet portrait, okay? So tab, port. Okay, so what are we going to do with these? We will float them side by side, basically. So float left, and for that to work, we need them to have a relative position again. Because remember, up here we have an absolute positioning, but we're now getting rid of that. Okay. Also, I want the width to be the same for all, so 33.3333%. And then I also want them to have a slightly less pronounced shadow, let's say. So like only 3 for the blur, not like this. And then here just 20% for the black color, okay? And then I also have to undo some of the stuff that is here on each of these elements. So let's do that. So top, set it to 0. And then some changes down here as well. So top to 0 here as well. And then what do we have here? We have left 20%. We don't want anything like that. Left 0. And actually let me put the top 0 back here. All right. Now remember that we had some of them scaled up a bit. So let's take a look before we start that. All right. So now they are nicely sitting side by side. That's a lot better than what we had before already. But let's now, in order to make this a bit more creative, let's just slightly scale this one up and this one here as well. Or actually all of them, why not? So the one in the middle can be the biggest one. This one's slightly smaller than this here. Even smaller than that. All right, and now another thing that we can do is to put some top here. So 1 rem instead of 0 that we had. So to move this one down a bit and then move this one up a bit. So minus 1 rem. So let's take a look at that now. Well, that doesn't look okay. So looks like the transform didn't really apply. Transform, translate. And of course, that's not what I wanted at all. I wanted scale. Stupid mistake again. And now that looks a bit better than before. Now all we have to change is to put this one here on the top. So let's give it a higher z-index than the rest of them. Let's say just 100. All right. And actually this effect here still works. But on a touch device, this is not really gonna happen anyway. So we can just ignore that one. Okay, so I like this section as it is right now. So let's move on here to the next one. And what I would change in here is maybe give it a bit less padding and decrease this kind of spacing here. Okay, so just small adjustment. And then we should be good to go as well. So composition, and where is this one? Yeah, it's a feature box. And I'm doing it in the same breakpoint again. So include, respond, tab, port. So a slight decrease of the padding. And then here the margin can be actually set to 0. Okay, so just a really small adjustment. And now, well, I think we still have too much space here, to be honest. So let's decrease the padding that we have in the section, okay? So back to the home here. Yeah, down here. So section features. So let's put 10 here as well. And yeah, I prefer it this way. Now it looks more symmetric here. So the space between this one here, it's now equal, like the line is right at the middle of these two sections now. So a lot better. So we're doing great progress here. Now what we have to do next is to fix these next three sections. So this one here, the tours, then we can fix this one here because this looks really messy right now. And then finally we fix the booking, all right? But we're gonna leave that for the next lecture so that you can take a quick break here and then come back to coding this last part. So this is the third and last part of writing our media queries. And this time we're gonna make the tours, the stories, and the book sections responsive. So starting with the tours, this is what it looks like right now. Now it actually doesn't look so bad, but the big problem here is that we have to actually touch it in order to rotate the card. Because on touch devices, there's no such thing as a hover. And so the only way to actually move the card is to click it. And that's not practical, right? We don't want this here to sit at the back of our card, right? So we must find a way to actually change this entire card, okay? So this will be half a rewrite of this card. And what I have in mind for this, so what I want to achieve in the end is just something like this, okay? Let me close this one here a bit. All right, so this entire card will be like this. So this is similar to what we had before, then the list, and then the part that was originally on the back will now be here at the bottom, okay? And then that 3 times, one after the other. All right, and so this way people can actually see the price and click book now if they want to. So let's go ahead and do that. And once again, we're starting at the, of course, at the 900 pixel media query, so tablet portrait. So let's open up the card. Here it is. And this time we are going to make it a bit differently, okay? Because this is like a whole rewrite of the entire thing. And so we're not just tweaking some stuff here. And so let's actually do a big media query at the end and then copy all of that in there and only change what we need to change, okay? So we put a big media query down here. So include, respond, tab, port. And now let's get this stuff here, copy it in there, and then we're gonna remove what we don't need, which is most of it, but it's still easier to do it like this than to copy all the things that we need. Okay, so select it again, just so I can indent it a bit. And so where is the end of this actually? Yeah. All right. Now we don't need any of these perspective stuff, and the position also we don't need. But what we can change is the height here, okay? Because remember we set this height here to make the front side the same size as the back side, and also to make the sides having the same height as the container, okay? But now that's no longer necessary, and so I don't want that. And so we set it to auto, okay? And so now we overwrite that 52 and set it to auto. And the same thing actually here on the side, okay? Now what's also gonna happen is that these are no longer an absolute position, okay? So they will now be relative position because we now no longer have two sides basically occupying the same space, okay? And so they will now be relative. And so first we will have the front side, and then after that, the back side, remember? So we don't want to change this. We don't have to change any of this, I believe. This one should move as well. We don't need to change any of this. Then the front part also doesn't need any changing. And then the back part, we don't need any of this. But what we do need is to get rid of this transform. So right now the back part is rotated 180 degrees, remember, but we don't want that. So we need to change it back to 0, right? So let's now take a look actually. And well, actually not much changed, except that the back part is completely gone. So let's take a look at why that is happening. So card side, and I see that it basically doesn't have any height. So let's see why that is happening. Well, actually the height is set to auto, so I'm not really sure what's going on here. But maybe it has to do with the fact that this card here is absolute. Let's take a look at that. Well, that's also not the reason, but I'm sure it will just work out a bit later when we continue with this, okay? So the front side here should not rotate at all when we hover it. So set it to 0. And this here stays the same because the side back should also not rotate. And so this is just as it was. So we can get rid of it. All right, and now the styling here. So the first part should actually stay the same. Okay, so I want this to stay exactly the same, so the exact same style. So very simple, just get rid of all of this. We don't want to change anything. So all of that, let's remove it. All right, now here let's set it to relative as I did before in the DevTools. And then this one here we set to 0, to 0, and we want no translate at all. And we also want the 100% width. All right, this one we didn't change, so let's get rid of it. We don't want to change these as well. Maybe the margin, but first we have to actually see it. Then the price here, we don't want to change at all. And then the price value, maybe also the font size. We'll see about that. Okay, but anyway, let's take a look now, and now it should somehow appear. And yeah, so here it is. Great. So we should probably decrease this margin here. Then we should give this a padding here, and then use a clip path to make it look the same way as here. So this corner here. So this non-rectangular design, as I've been calling it. Okay, so let's start with that and remove this margin here. So the margin here, let's put it to something really small, like 3 rem. Some padding in here. So let's say padding 4 rem. And now, as I was saying, let's use a clip path here for the backside. Give it some space here so we can nicely separate it from the rest. Okay. So clip path, polygon. And how should this one look like? Well, if it starts here, okay, so it should start here. So this is the starting point. And so this time we don't start at 0, 0, because 0, 0 would be here. So in the X direction, so this way here, we still have 0, but in here we move down a little bit. Okay, so let's do that here. So 0x and maybe 15% in Y. And then the others are just the regular corners. So 100% in the X direction, 0 in the Y direction, right? And by now you're already 100% familiar with this, I'm sure. Now the other corner is 100, 100, because it's, just to remind you, this is 100 in the X direction and 100 in the Y direction, right? And now just the last part here, so that we don't cut off all of this. Okay, so in here we now have 0 again in the X direction and 100 in the Y direction. And that should do it. All right, now one thing is that, of course, here we don't have enough margin, but the bigger problem is these rounded corners that we have here. And then we also want the entire element to have a white background, okay? Plus this shadow here is now only on the front side, and it should be on the entire thing. So 3 things that we have to change now. Let's do it. So starting with the border radius, let's remove it from here and we can put it here on this element. So basically the container element, the card element itself. Then also we want the background color to be white. Color white. So that should fix it. And now the shadow that we had before, let me see where it is. And so yeah, it was here on the side, but we no longer want it on the side, we want it on the entire card element, right? So we need to change that. So the box shadow that was here, we need to remove it, set it to none, and then put it here on the card. All right, and now just for this padding here, it should be a bit more at the top. So let's say 7 rem at the top 4 on the right, and then 4 on all the other sides. Okay, so let's take a look at this now. And all right, that looks pretty good to me, actually. Let's try to decrease it a bit. And yeah, it continues looking great, right? Maybe we can decrease some padding here. Let's take a look. Yeah, so we have 3 RAM here. So let's get rid of that. Let's actually copy it from here, since that we already have it. So, whoa, what's that? What's going on here? So I closed this accidentally. All right, so just card details. Okay, I shouldn't have done this, I guess. Would be easier to just to have written it out. So padding at the top, let's put it to 0, and then on the side only 3 RAM. So how does that look like? Well, maybe 1 RAM is better, but that should be it. All right. So that are the cards. Looks pretty good now, I think. And yeah, maybe just decreasing this font size here, but that's also pretty easy for RAM. All right, so next up we have this this story section here, and this looks a bit weird as well. So let's get rid of these problems. For starters, let's make this here a square again, so that it can really fit more text, and so that we don't waste all of this white space that we have here on the side. Okay, it's a big waste of space, and we don't need that on this small screen. So it is the story component, and so let's check it out. All right, so include, respond, and once again, let's do it for the tablet portrait. And starting to increase here the width to 100%. That should help already. So just take a look. And so we start here. And yeah, well, that's not really correct. It should be 90%. Is it 90% actually? Let's take a look. Inspect. Ah, okay, this is happening because of the row. Okay, so the row is taking away that space. But it still looks okay, I believe, actually, all the way until 600. So at 600 is when we should actually start to change things here, because up until this point, it's still okay. So let's just remove some padding here from this, and then we can move on to the phone media query, okay? So the padding that we have currently is, where is it? Yeah, 6 and 9. So we can decrease these values a bit to, say, 4 and 7. So decreasing them both by 2 RAMs. And yeah, so now we have some more breathing space in here. Okay. And now at 600 pixels, so at the phone, let's do some more changes. So for the phone, we want to get rid of this completely, sort of this weird shape. So set it to 0. And then the same thing for the shape, of course, because right now it has 12 degrees to compensate for that, the skewing that we did there. Now we actually also have to copy this one here. Remember that it's the exact same thing. So this transform has to have the translate and the skew just like this one. But the translate is still okay, but what we need to change is the skew from 12 to 0, right? And then there should be another one somewhere. And where is it? Ah, yeah, right here. Well, that's not what I wanted. All right. So that gets rid of the skewing. So, all right, that's better actually. All right, so this looks okay on all of these screen sizes here. So I'm pretty happy with this one. So let's move on. And this one here, to be honest, looks terrible, right? But it shouldn't be all too hard to fix. So let's very quickly do that as well. So the first part is here in the home, remember? So down here in this book section, is where most of the layout actually happens. Okay, so let's include or mix in here, respond. Then let's actually take a look and where this starts to look that bad. So in here, it's kind of still acceptable, right? But then it starts to look really bad. And well, we should fix that. Even at this media query here. So the tablet landscape. So tab land. And the main thing that we need to change is actually this gradient here. And what we can do for starters is to simply set this to 70, 70, and then also setting the width of this box where the form is in also to 70%. And that should already increase it and improve the situation. Okay, now one thing that we actually skipped when we designed this card was this height here, okay? So we should have removed that, but I totally forgot. So let's do that now, okay? Don't forget to remove that height. That was just for testing purposes, but for some reason I then let it there accidentally. So let's take a look. So 1210, all right. So that's better, to be honest. And now as we approach the 900 media query, okay, actually this image here is starting to already look a bit weird. So we should fix that. And I'm going to show you how. So what we'll do here is to basically make this image occupying the entire height and not the entire width as it's doing right now. Okay, so why is it occupying the entire width right now? Well, that's because of background size 100%. Remember, that's similar to background cover, but it's not really the same, because what this does is to ensure that the image fits the container in the X direction, basically. Okay, but what we want right now is really the cover. Okay, so I'm going to change that to background size actually and cover. And actually I think that 70 is a bit too much here. So 65, 65, and then down here as well, 65. And now it behaves just as we want it. Okay, so covering the entire element. Okay, and now starting from 900, so from the tablet size, we need to do some more changes. So respond, tab, port, okay, so this background image here is what needs to change, of course. Now we don't want this 105 degrees here. We don't care at all about that. Let's just put any direction, it doesn't really matter. So to right, okay, and now starting from 0 to 100% and no transparent at all. So it will all be covered in white now, okay? That's what we really want. And then the width in here should be, let's actually copy this. So port, and now we want the 100% width. All right. And so that looks pretty good. Not perfect here, so there's some more stuff that we can fix, of course. So let's do that as well. But for this part here, we're good. And so let's now go to the form. So what can we fix? And the first thing that came to my mind was to fix this radio group. So include respond tab port and set it width to 100% and maybe a margin to the bottom, because otherwise it will be one on top of another. And so yeah, that's better. Give it some more space. And now this looks like a real form to me. Also, I think there's something going on with this here. I think it's 90% width only, if I am not mistaken. So let's copy this. And yeah, that's right. So let's change that to width 100%. And here we go. All right. So this looks pretty good to me. It's not perfect, as I was saying in the beginning, but I don't want to worry all too much about this. I don't want to make it 100% perfect, because this was just to demonstrate you how we actually work with media queries. So I now encourage you to keep working at this, to make it really perfect, to change every single detail that could be better. I also want you to test this on real devices, if you can. And there's also a cool app that you can test, which is called SASS, I believe. Okay. Then if you have your page online somewhere, then you can just enter the URL here, and then it will show you the page on a lot of different devices. You can just load this example here. And so this is how it looks like. So you have this page on all of these devices here at the same time, and you can check it out how it looks on all of them. Okay, so SASS is how it's called. I will also put a link on my resources page. All right, and I have one last challenge for you, which is actually when you hit this button here. Okay, so this is right now the pop-up, and I'm not going to change it because I want this to be a challenge for you. So before moving on, get your hands dirty with this part here of the website and make it completely responsive. You can put the images here on top, for example, or you can put them at the bottom, whatever you like. You're completely free to do it as you wish. Okay, so that's my challenge for you. And after that, we're going to move on to responsive images. Okay, so good luck with that challenge and see you later. Big parts of our website are already 100% responsive by now, but there is one important aspect we haven't really tackled yet, and that is responsive images. Now, we do have flexible images already, so our images nicely scale with the viewport width, but responsive images take things to a whole new level. And that's because responsive images are not only an aspect of responsive design, but even more importantly, of web performance. Remember this diagram we talked about right in the beginning of the course, where I told you how important performance is? Well, here it is again, because responsive images are crucial for web performance. So, what are responsive images all about? The philosophy behind responsive images is to serve the right image to the right screen size and device, using different techniques in HTML or CSS so that users don't have to download images that are way too large for their devices. For example, let's suppose the image for this heroes section is 1 MB large, okay? Now, it may be absolutely okay to send this 1 MB image to a desktop computer, but it's not okay to send this 1 MB to a phone, which may have a slow or expensive data plan somewhere in the world. As developers, we really have a responsibility here, and responsive images help us solve these problems. So instead of sending 1 MB to whatever device is consuming the page, it makes way more sense to send the 1 MB image to a device with a large screen that actually needs the image, and a much smaller version of the image to a device with a small screen that doesn't need such a large image anyway, right? And that's what we're gonna do, and it's pretty exciting to be able to do this, in my opinion. It's really cool. So let me just tell you that this is pretty advanced stuff, and that not many developers out there know and take this even seriously. So once again, knowing this advanced stuff will really bring you to a complete new level. Now, in which situations should we actually use responsive images? There are mainly 3 use cases where it makes sense. The first one is called resolution switching. And all that we do in resolution switching is to serve up the same image for a smaller screen, but with a smaller resolution. So basically, just like we saw on the slide before, same image, but a smaller version for a device that doesn't need such a big image. Next, there is density switching, which is actually a special case of resolution switching, but where the screen size does not matter, but the screen pixel density does instead. So what is pixel density? Well, in simple terms, pixel density is the amount of pixels found in an inch or a centimeter. Now, what matters to us is that there are low resolution screens and high resolution screens. Low resolution screens are just typical PC screens, I would say, and they can be called 1x screen, because they use 1 pixel to display 1 pixel of our design. So if we say an image should be 100 pixels high, they will actually use 100 physical pixels in the screen to display these 100 pixels that we specified. Now, high-resolution screens are the ones found in all modern smartphones, and even some computers already have them, like the MacBooks with Retina displays. These are high-resolution screens and can be called 2x screens because they actually use 2 physical pixels to display 1 pixel of our design. So if we say we want an image to be 100 pixels high, it will actually be 200 pixels in a physical screen. And this all happens automatically, of course. Now, what does all of that mean for our images? Well, it means that if we want our images to look sharp on high-resolution displays, which use double the amount of pixels, then we actually have to serve an image with double the resolution of the original image, right? And that's what density switching is for, to serve one image to a high-resolution screen and another one if the screen is low resolution. Alright, and the last use case is called art direction. Art direction happens when you don't just want to serve the same image but in smaller resolution, but a whole different image for a different screen size. For example, you may want to keep the important details in an image, but remove parts of the image around these details, just like in this example, where the size of the details doesn't even change on the small screen, just stays the same. Or you could also want to load a completely different image altogether, and responsive images actually allow you to do that. So, in conclusion, resolution and density switching is when you want to serve the same image but with different resolutions, and art directions is when you want to serve a completely different image. Now, why are we even talking about these different situations? We are because it's important to distinguish between the different use cases because they require us to use different solutions in our HTML and CSS code. So we have to choose accordingly. Make sense? And since code is what really matters here, that's what we're going to do next. So let's now move on to the next lecture and start implementing some responsive images in our HTML. So after hearing about the different use cases for responsive images, let's now implement density switching and art direction in HTML. In this lecture, you will learn how to use the source set attribute on the image and source HTML elements together with density descriptors, and also how and why to use the picture element for art direction with media queries in HTML. So this lecture will be about responsive images in HTML. Now, what's the difference between images in HTML and in CSS? Well, basically, with images in HTML, I simply mean all the img tags, so all the image tags where we specify a source for the image. So for example, here, this logo that we have here, this is an image. Then these 3 images here, we also specified them in the HTML. Then these here I think are also images, and then also this logo. So that's images in HTML, and in CSS, of course, it's when we use background image. So such as this one, these ones here, so they are also background images, and so that's a difference. So for these images here, we will use CSS for responsive images, and for the other ones, we will do stuff in HTML. So I'm starting with HTML because there are actually more technologies for doing responsive images in HTML. And the one we're going to use this on is, for now, this one here, okay? So we're going to do art direction and density switching on this logo down here in the footer. So how do we do that? And I'm going to start with density switching because that's actually the most simple one. So remember the philosophy behind density switching. Basically, what we want to do is to serve a larger version of the same image for high resolution screens and serve a smaller version of the same image for a low density screen, right? And so basically we need to have 2 images, one for each of the resolutions. And actually I do have that. So let's take a look. So logo green, 1x and 2x. So 1x and 2x. Right now this is the one that we're using, so 2x, and that has 300 pixels in width. So let's just take a look at this one here. So here you see it's the 2x. And here in the DevTools you can also see that the natural size of the image here is 300 pixels, right? So what I showed you in the code editor, but that it's displaying with only 150 pixels here on the screen. Okay, and that makes sense because that's actually the width that we specified over here in 15 rem, right? So it makes sense that the 2x image has exactly double the width of the width that it is displayed on the screen, right? Because high resolution screens use 2 physical pixels to display 1 pixel in our design. Okay, so that's what we talked about in the last lecture. This is just a recap of that. So this is the 2x image, and this is the one that we want to display on low resolution screens, the 1x image. Okay, and so you see here that it has a width of only 150 pixels. So how do we do that? Well, we can keep using the image element. We just have to change the source attribute to source set. Okay, and so now we can specify 2 images. And the first one I'm going to specify is image logo green 1x. And now we can put here something called a density descriptor. Okay, and the density descriptor is very simple. I'll just write 1x for this one here, and then 2x for this one. So now this source set attribute here allows the browser to choose the best of these 2 images here, so this one and this one, according to the screen that is used by the user to display the web page. So if it's a low density screen, it will use this image here, okay, because we said that this image should be used for a low resolution screen, and when a device has a high resolution screen, then it will use this image because we said so, because we said that this image should be used for high resolution. So that's the 2x density descriptor for that. And that's actually it. So with this image, with this source set attribute, we give the browser the choice to choose the best image for each situation. Now the results of this are a bit difficult to demonstrate here in the browser, okay? So what we see here happening is that it says here now current source, and then we see that it's logo green 2x. And that's because I'm using a high resolution screen here. But if you're using a low resolution screen, then it will probably say logo green 1x for you, okay? And if you then wanted this to work on a high resolution screen, well, then you need a device to actually test this out, okay? So with this, we just have to really trust that it's going to work as long as we do everything in a correct way, okay? So this is density switching in HTML, and that's the most easiest use case for responsive images. Now, next up, we want to do art direction. And remember what that is? Well, what we want to do with art direction is to tell the browser to use one image on one screen width and another image on another screen width. Okay, so we want to make images depend on the screen width. And the solution for that is to use an HTML element called picture. Okay, and actually this is where I'm going to put this class now, this footer logo class. So I want this to be here right now. So that will now be our image basically. Okay, so and what do we have inside of the picture? First off, we have to specify a source element, and we have to specify an image as well. And these are basically the different options that we're going to give the browser for images to display. Now we always have to use at least one image here and 0 or more sources. But 0 sources doesn't make any sense, so we want at least one source and then followed by an image, which is basically the fallback. And the image that we want is actually this one. Okay, and now we can do something very similar with the source. So once again, we can use source set in here, and then the media attribute. And that is where the real magic happens here, okay? So in the media attribute, we can basically put a CSS media query, okay? So let's start by doing that. And let's actually use the one that we use in our design as well. So I'm going to use this one for the phone. Okay, so we want the art direction to happen at the breakpoint of the phone. Okay, and that's the way that we do it. So we specify the max width of 600 pixels in this case. So this one here means 600 pixels. And then we say the image that we want here in case that the width is lower than 600 pixels. So just like in media queries, okay? All right, so what do we put here? Well, logo green small. Let me just show that to you. So we have logo green small. And once again, we have the 1x version. So this one here. And we have the 2x version. Okay, and so we can actually do the same thing as we did before. So we can use our density descriptors again. So we say that if it's a low resolution screen, we want to use this small image here with 1x. And if it's a high resolution screen, And let me just copy this. Then we want a high resolution image. So the larger image in that case. Okay, and that's actually it. So let's recap what we're doing here. We started by using the picture element, in which we can basically specify multiple sources for one image. And then in the source element, we can actually write a media query just like we do in CSS. And so with this, we force the browser to use this image source set here, this image source set, in case that max width is less than 600 pixels. And in case it's not, so if it's larger than 600 pixels, then the browser is forced to use this image source set. So that is called art direction. Different images for different viewport width. All right. Now then inside of each of these sources, we then do density switching. And that's why we're using the source set attribute instead of the source attribute. And so here we give the browser a choice to use either the high resolution or the low resolution image according to the screen which the web page is viewed on. So let's test that out. And this one here we will actually be able to see, at least if everything's working fine. So let's decrease, and all right. So we reached our 600 pixel breakpoint here, and so now we have the small image here. So perfect. And so now as you hover here this image, you can see that the current source, well, it doesn't move. Okay, but it says that the current source is logo green small 2x. And that's exactly what we want to happen, right? So perfect. We could now of course go ahead and add another source element with another media query here, and then add more and more different versions of the image. But I don't believe that to be necessary. So that is this image here, which is now working just fine. So we just implemented responsive images here, which is really great. And we then have more images to work upon. Now this ones here, I'm not going to do them, okay? Because once again, this is more to show you all of the technology and not to waste time optimizing every single aspect of the page. What I'm going to do though in the next lecture is to apply responsive images to these three images. And by then we're going to use resolution switching instead of art direction, because we do that in a slightly different way. So that's what we're going to do next. And so let's now move on to the next lecture. After art direction in the last lecture, we're now going to implement resolution switching with HTML. And so you're going to learn how to allow the browser to decide which is the best image to download, using the source set attribute with descriptors and the size attribute of the image element. But before we do all of that, I wanted to show you something here in the DevTools, which allows us to also test out the resolution of our screen, okay? So we can come up here to this menu and hit Add Device Pixel Ratio, okay? And so now we can test if we have the 2x or the 1x image here going on. Now the problem with this is that it doesn't really work well. So I've done some experiments with this in the past for a couple of hours, and it usually didn't always work, okay? So that's kind of a problem, but let's try it out now. So the device pixel ratio here is now set to 1, and that means that we have a low resolution screen, okay? And so therefore what we have here should be the logo green 1x, right? So this one here. Now in order to be absolutely sure, we can actually come here to the inspector, then come here to this, which says properties, then here the image, and down here we can see the current source, okay? And so here we can see that it's actually using logo green 1x, okay? So for a device pixel ratio of 1. Now if we change this to 2, let's reload the page, and I think that now it actually changed, okay? And so if you come here now to current source, then we see logo green 2x, okay? And so now as we're simulating a high resolution screen, then the browser actually uses our higher resolution image. So that's working. Now for the small screen, let's reload that again and take a look at what we have here. And yeah, so it's using the logo small at 2x. So still again as we planned. So this one here right now. And now let's change it here to 1 as well. Reload it. And now I think that this time it didn't really work. Let's test that. And yeah, so it still says 2x. But that's a problem here in Google Chrome, okay? So actually, if you would to use this in the real world, then the right image would load, okay? So don't worry about the result here so much. Let's try that again, and it still says green small 2x. Okay, I'm going to change this maybe to 3 or something. Then back to 1, reload, and you have to really play around in order to get the right result here, which doesn't make much sense. But again, I believe there is a small bug going on. So let's try that again. Okay, and now we see green small 1x. Okay, so that's the image that we want. And so now Google Chrome is correctly displaying that, okay? So besides testing here for different screen width, we can also simulate different device pixel ratios. So basically different pixel densities, okay? All right, but now it's time for resolution switching. And as I mentioned before, the images that I'm going to use to experiment with that will be these images in here, okay? So let's take a look at when they start to change, and that's here at this 900 pixel query. All right, so let's get back to our HTML and get our hands dirty with this code. So where do we have this? And yeah, so here we go. So how do we actually approach this problem? Unlike in art direction, where we basically force the browser to use a certain image according to a media query, in this approach that we're using right now, we allow the browser to choose the best image for the current viewport and pixel density situation. So let's write out how we are going to do that. So again, we're using an image, and again, we're using the source set here, okay? Now for each of these image, so net 1, 2, and 3, let's take a look here at the folder. So we have net 1 and net 1 large. So let's open these two. And so you see that the big one has 1000 pixels of width, and the smaller one has only 300, okay? So our source set is image net 1, and then image net 1 large. All right, so right now this is a bit similar to density switching, which we did before, right? But in density switching, we then used the density descriptors, right? Like 1x or 2x. But right now we're going to use something else, which is called the width descriptor, okay? And so what we do here is to basically inform the browser of the width of these images. So remember, this one has 300 pixels, and so we write 300W, okay, which probably stands for width, and then this one here has 1000. And so by using these width descriptors, we basically inform the browser of the width of each of these images without the browser having to download them to get access to that information. So that is the first step. Okay, but that alone is not enough for the browser to figure out which image to download, because what the browser knows is its viewport width and its display density. But that alone is, again, not enough to decide which of these two images to choose. So we have to give it something else. And we do that with the sizes attribute. So sizes. So what is the sizes attribute here all about? Well, basically we use sizes to inform the browser about the approximate width of the image at different viewport width. And so with that information, together with the width descriptor here, the browser can then figure out which is the perfect image to use for the current viewport width and the current display resolution. So let me show you how to do that. So basically this is a list of a couple of breakpoints that we define and at which we know approximately what the width of the image will be. So let's use all breakpoints that we've used before, so 900 pixels. Then here we say the width that the image will be. So 900 pixel is this one here, no, actually this one. And so let's take a look. Okay, so these are the images. That's the one we just included, but it's not working already. So let's ignore that for now. And so this here is our image. So let's inspect it. And we see that the width is like 170, okay? And so we can actually divide this, so 171 by 900, okay? And so this is basically 20%, all right? So we can say basically that this image here has a width of 20% of the viewport width, right? So let's inform the browser of that. That's it, actually. As simple as that. Now we can do another breakpoint, like 600 here. And so let's see what we have here. Well, it's still 171. And so now it's 28, 29, 30. We can actually say 30. Okay. So let's say max width at 600 pixel, we have 30 viewport width. Okay, and then at the end, like a default, we can put in the default size. And what is the default size? Well, our default font size is, I think it's, we defined it as, and here we see it. So approximately 300 pixels, right? See that? So it says 297, but we can say 300. So that's the default if none of these conditions here apply, okay? All right, and so now we just need the alt attribute that we had before. So photo1, and also this class, okay? And I'm putting it in different line here so that it is easier to read. And actually we should do another thing, which is to actually include the source as well in the image. And that is in case the user is using an older browser which doesn't support source set, neither sizes, and these new attributes. Okay, so if a browser doesn't understand any of this here, so any of this, then it can still use the source attribute. Okay, and we should do that down here in the footer as well. So where is that? Yeah, so right here. So let's set the source to this image here, okay? Just in case source set is not supported by the browser that the user is using. Okay, but this will be ignored in case that the browser understands source set. So no problem with that. So let's go back. And here we go. That will now comment out this entire code here. And then copy this entire construct here for the other images. So here, 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 and here, it's all number 2. Right, and then copy it again. To 3, 4, 5, and all at 3. All right, and that is actually it. So this entire thing here will take care of actually both resolution switching and density switching. Okay, because we gave the browser enough information to figure out exactly what to do depending on both the viewport width and the pixel density, so the screen resolution. So let's take a look at that now. Reload this entire thing. And well, maybe something weird is going on. Let's go back to that. All right, so let's inspect this here. And here we go. And again, I'm going to use here this properties, just to take a look at the current source. And you see that it's already working. So it's using the small net3 image here, and here probably the same. So where is it? Down here. So it's using the small net1 image here because we have this this smaller pixel density here, okay? And so we specified this image as being 300 pixels, and so it's actually using the image which has a width of 300 pixels, not the larger one, which actually has a width of 1000 pixels. So if you change that to 2, then it should use that one. So let's check that. And yeah, so right now it's using the net3 large image. And the same thing for the other two, I'm sure. And yeah, so now it's using the net1 large, and that is because we have this higher pixel density, and therefore it chooses, the browser chooses to use the larger image, which actually has 1000 pixels in width. But this is the image that it has to use if it wants to display 2 pixels of the image in 1 pixel in the design. So that's the philosophy behind the 2x screen, right? So that's working already. And let's now move down to the smaller screen here. And I'm going to reload. And so let's take a look at what we have now, which image it is using now. And we're still using the net1 large. Let's push that even further down. So really, really small here now. Let's make it even smaller. Reload. And so let's see now. Because right now the image is really small, right? As you see, it's only 116 pixels wide. And so now the net to image here would already be enough. Okay. So let's take a look at that. And actually it says it's using the net to large. But I don't really believe that it is, because as I mentioned before, sometimes this doesn't really work really well, this device pixel ratio option here, okay? Sometimes it doesn't really work. So if you would test this in the real world, then I'm sure that it would actually load this smaller image, because it's such a small image in here that even with the higher pixel density here, the small image is more than enough to display all of that pixels that we want. Okay, so let's maybe put that to 3. Sorry, put that to 3, reload, then increase, put to 2, then decrease again, just to see if it changes that value. Okay, then reload again. So let's take a look at that now. And it still says large. Okay, it's not a problem, because as I said, I'm sure that it's working the way it should. Maybe if you are seeing this on a 1x screen actually, so a lower density screen, then it will show you that it's using the net1. And so that depends, of course, on your screen. I'm currently recording this video on a high density screen. And so maybe that's the reason why it stays here at the large image, even if the small one would be more than enough. Okay. So I hope all of that made sense to you. And so my challenge for you now is to actually go ahead and change the other images. So for example, these images here, so these ones, and then also the ones we have here. So I challenge you to create some smaller versions of these images and then play around with this technique that I just showed you in order to make all of these images responsive. Because your users in the future, they will appreciate the extra effort, the extra mile that you go in order to make the website better for them and more responsive and more performant for the users with a smaller screen, for example, with a slow data connection on their smartphone. And so we have to think about all of these possibilities and not leaving responsive images just as an afterthought, okay? So I showed you how it works. And so again, I look forward for you to complete this with all the other images that we have on the page. Now, just to make sure that you really understood, let's just take 30 seconds and recap what we've done here, okay? So we have two versions of the same image. One has 300 pixels and one has 1000 pixels, which is the large one. And so in the source set attribute here, we specify the width descriptor and specify exactly the width in pixels that each image has. So this one 300, this one 1000. Then next, we use the sizes attribute to specify the approximate width in viewport width units for different breakpoints. And you could add even more if you wanted, that wouldn't be a problem at all. So actually the more the better, the more precise the browser will know which image to choose. And then finally, if none of these breakpoints here apply, we just use our default here basically. And that is it. So the browser, as it's loading the HTML document, it knows its current viewport width and it knows its current pixel density of the screen. And having in mind all the information here that we provided, it then can choose which image to download, okay? And that's the entire philosophy behind this resolution switching method. Now just to compare it again with the art direction, let's come back here again to the footer. So here it is a bit different. So what we do here is to basically force the browser to use this image here that we give it here in case that this media query applies. And so the browser doesn't really have a choice, which is actually exactly what we want for art direction, okay? So that's actually it for responsive images in HTML. I hope that made sense to you. And if you have any questions about this, make sure to post them in the Q&A section on Udemy and you're gonna get help there. And then go ahead and change all of the images of this page to responsive images. Welcome back. So the final piece in the puzzle of responsive images is to implement them in CSS now. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn how to do exactly that by using media queries to target high-resolution displays. Plus, I'll show you how to combine multiple conditions in media queries, which can be quite handy sometimes, especially when trying to implement responsive images. So what we're going to do in this lecture is to make this background image here for the hero a bit more responsive, okay? So again, there are a lot of background images here on this page. So this one, then these three here, as well as, as this one here. So all of these background images can be made responsive, but I will only take care of this one, and I will leave the other ones for you, such as I did with responsive images in HTML, okay? So I created a smaller version of the hero image, and it's called Hero Small, okay? So the original one is this one, which has 2000 pixels of width. And you see that this one here is a lot smaller, so 260 pixels versus 600. So a huge difference actually. So let's go to our header, which is exactly where we're going to implement this. All right, and so responsive images in CSS are actually pretty straightforward, because all we have to do is to write media queries in order to load different images for different situations. Now, up until this point, we have only ever written media queries related to the screen or the viewport width, right? But there are other types of media queries, and one of them is to target resolution. Okay, so we can implement different styles not only depending on different viewport width, but also depending on other things such as the device resolution. So let's write a media query like that. So media, and then the one that we're going to use is called min resolution. And we're going to set it to a value of 192 dots per inch. And why is that? Well, it is 192 dots per inch because that's the resolution of the Apple Retina screen, okay? And so that's a high resolution screen that's usually used as a reference here, okay? So since this is a min media query, this is basically the same logic as with the min width media query, okay? So whenever the resolution is higher than 192 dots per inch, the code that is in here will be applied. Okay, and so what do we put here? Well, we put the background image. All right, now here in the normal state, let's say, what we actually want to load is the small hero image. Okay, because if we have just a normal screen without the high resolution, then the hero small with 1200 pixels is perfectly enough, especially considering that it's hidden behind this layer of the green color here, okay? And so the resolution can be even smaller. And so for the normal situation, we're basically considering that we're using a small resolution screen, and so there we load the small hero image. But then we write this media query in which we say if the resolution is higher than 192 dots per inch, then please load the hero image, okay? So let's test that in the browser. And actually to see the difference, I will change the color here of this gradient, okay? So I'm setting this to secondary. So now we know that when the image looks green, then we're using the primary color, and therefore we know that it's the small hero here. And when it becomes yellow, which is the secondary color, yellow or orange, well then we know that it's the hero, right? So let's check that out. I'm going to reload it. And so we have the green image here now. So let's actually inspect this as well. So the header, and so we have our hero small here. But now if we increase the pixel density here to 2, well, then all of a sudden it becomes orange. And what that means is that we're now using the hero image, so the bigger version of the image. All right, so that already works pretty well. But we can even improve on this. So let's say that the screen is only very small. So for example, for a screen. So that's the 600 pixel media query, remember? So imagine that we have a screen with 600 pixels. And usually these really small screens, they're usually phones. And phones, they usually have a pixel density of 2. So they're usually 2x screens always. Okay, so we can consider that. Now if the screen is 600 and if the pixel density is 2, well then the image that we need at this size doesn't have to be larger than 1200 pixels, right? So 600 times 2 is 1200. And so an image which has 1200 pixels of width is more than enough to display on a high density screen like this. Okay? And therefore, it's not really logic to load this huge image, so this 2000 pixel image here on this really small screen, right? So how do we do that? Well, we can actually extend this media query here and add a second condition. So what we want is when the resolution is larger than 192, but at the same time, the width is larger than 600, right? So that's the part I just talked about. So min width 600 pixels. All right, so let's recap what's happening here. So the large version of the hero image is shown when the resolution is higher than 192, so when we have a 2x screen, and at the same time, whenever the width is larger than 600 pixels. Because if it's below 600 pixels, then it doesn't really make sense to display such a high resolution image. Okay, and so let's now test if that works. And yeah, it works. So we see that in here we now are back to using the hero small, and so it's green. But as we approach 600, yeah, here you see that it's working already. So now we are back to using the big hero image, because starting at this point, it makes sense to have a bigger image. All right, and so you just learned two things at the same time. First, how to target these higher resolution screens using this part, and then you learned how to combine multiple conditions in a media query. All right, now when else does it make sense to use the larger image? So let's take a look. Imagine that we have a lower resolution screen. So when would it make sense to actually use the 2000 pixel image? Well, basically if the screen is really huge. So for example, starting at 2000 pixels. So why not write a media query saying that as soon as we hit 2000 pixels, we want to display the hero image, so the original, not the small one. All right? So that's a small challenge for you right now. So I want you to pause the video and implement what we just said. So basically, we want to see the hero as soon as the width becomes larger than 2000 pixels. So I hope you managed to do that. So media, min width, and that's already it. Because all we have to do now is to just copy this here. And why is it a min width? Well, very simply because 2000 is basically the minimum width that needs to happen in order for this to happen. Okay, and so basically we're asking the question, is the width larger than 2000? And if it is, then we apply this hero image. Okay, so let's now try that. And yep, we reach the 2000 pixels and then the larger image gets loaded. Great, that's fantastic, okay? Really cool. Now, of course, if we are already at 2 here, then this media query doesn't take any effect because then the image will be the large version already anyway, okay? Now we can do even better than this because this code here is the exact same as this one. And so we can actually combine these two media queries. And so basically these two conditions. So this is a condition and this is another one. So let me copy this and then I can just put a comma here. And so basically that is like an or. So we say now, well, please apply this code if this one here happens or if this happens. And so this is the exact same thing, but with less code. And that's of course way better. All right, and just to prove you that it still works like this, yeah, of course, here we go on the smaller screen here. And then of course, with the low resolution, but it starts working at 2000. Yep, that's what happens. Now all we have to do is to convert this here to M. Okay, so 600 divided by 16, such as we did before, so 37.5. Because remember, our media queries are always in M. And now the same thing for 2000 divided by 16, 125 M. And just to be 100% sure now, let's reload this. And yeah, it still works. And actually you see these min width that we implemented here in orange color, right? So 125 M and 37.5 M as well. So that's these two conditions, this one and this one. And actually what we did before in the index HTML, we also had these media queries here, kind of. And so let's put them to M's as well. So this one with 37.5 M, and then 900 divided by 16 is 56.25. All right. And actually it was 56, not 65, so 56. All right, now it's correct. So back to our CSS, and actually that is already it. So that's a couple of techniques for responsive images with CSS. So basically it's just using media queries and some logic in order to achieve the results that we want based on different viewport sizes and resolutions of the screen. So that concludes our lectures about responsive images, which are, again, a topic that you shouldn't really ignore if you want to get serious with responsive design, okay? So I'll leave it as a challenge to you to implement a similar logic for all the other background images that we have in our CSS. And if you have any problems with that, then just feel free to post to the Q&A so that you can get some help with that. All right, so I hope that everything makes sense to you and that it was quite fun as well. And then see you in the next lecture after you finish the challenge. In a course about super modern CSS, of course there has to be a lecture about browser support. And so here it is. So why is this even important? Well, I'm not going to tell you why browser support is so important, because you already know the reasons for that, right? What I should tell you though, over and over again, is that many of the new and modern CSS features I showed you in this course are highly experimental. And right now, they only work in the top modern browsers. So this is important to keep in mind. Now, if you don't need to support older browsers, then that's perfect. You don't need to worry about this. But if you want to at least support some older browsers, then you should always start by checking a very handy tool called caniuse.com before using a property in production. Now, and here comes the cool part. Even if a browser doesn't support a property that we really want to use on a site, then we can still apply it to the modern browsers and show a different, more simple style on the older browsers. And that's a concept called graceful degradation. So providing a top-notch experience for modern browsers and providing an adapted, reduced version to browsers that don't understand all of these shiny new features. And how do we do that? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to teach you in this lecture. So you're going to learn how to use feature queries in CSS using the supports add rule. And with that, you can use the principle of graceful degradation on selected properties on your website. Plus, I'm also going to teach you yet another brand new CSS property called backdrop filter. So let's get to work. So this is how we left the website after the last lecture. And you see that we still have this orange color here going on, and that's because we forgot to remove it for our testing purposes in the media queries, right? But for now, let's leave it at that. And the first thing that I want to do is to show you that new property that I just mentioned called backdrop filter. So let me show you where I want to do that. And it's here in the pop-up. So now what backdrop filter does is to apply a filter to what's behind the selected element. And so what I want to do here is to add a backdrop filter to this background here with a blur. So basically blurring the background instead of making it dark as we have it here. Now the thing is that backdrop filter doesn't currently work on Google Chrome. So let me show that to you actually. So let's open that pop-up. And right here, adding backdrop filter, blur, and then 10 pixel. So we have to apply a value here in order to say how much blur we actually want. And this one currently only works in Safari, and so as I mentioned, not in Chrome. And actually to work in Safari, it needs to have the WebKit prefix. So let's add that. But I'm still leaving the unprefixed version here, because in the future it may work without the prefix. Okay, so let me show you that this is not working in Google Chrome. So we reloaded the page and it's not really working. But let me now show you the same thing in Safari. And if you're not on a Mac, you cannot really test this on Safari. You could only test it on a mobile Safari, like on an iPad or an iPhone or something. But that's not really the point here anyway, because what I just want to show you is how the add support rule works. So how the feature query works, okay? So anyway, you see here now that the background is actually blurred, right? So we keep scrolling here and everything you see here is blurred. And that's because that is exactly what is behind this element we selected and applied the backdrop filter, right? Now when we have this backdrop filter, we don't want this to be this dark. So this background shouldn't be so dark, okay? So what we want then is the background to be much lighter. So let me copy that to this place here, just for testing purposes. So let's say we wanted 0.3 in that case. So looking like this. So that looks a lot better, right? So how do we then implement this functionality in Safari and leave it the way it was in Google Chrome? And that's where the feature query comes in. All right. So this is how it works. Add support. And then in here we can make a test. So basically ask the browser if it supports a certain property. So let's copy this one in here. So this entire thing actually, so we cannot just put WebKit backdrop filter without this part here. So we always have to specify the value as well, okay? And just like in media queries, you can add some logic. And so I'm also gonna copy this part, okay? And so if this one is supported or this one, which in fact is the same, but since we have both versions, one with the prefix and one without, I'm just including both here. And now we can say what we want to happen if this property is supported, right? And what we want to happen is, of course, this part. And that's actually it. We just implemented graceful degradation using the supports add rule. So a feature query. So let's check that out in Safari. And here we go. So, well, you see something else going wrong here, but let's fix that in a second. For now, what matters here is that it works, that the background is this light color and not the black color that we specified up here, right? So if we take a look at that in Google Chrome, so let's reload that, then it will still be this dark color and not blurred because it's not working, obviously. So perfect, that's exactly how the feature query works. If it's not supported, then this code here is simply not applied. And if it is, then well, of course, this code here gets applied. Now about this other issue that I was noticing here in Safari, that is probably because of the backface visibility property. So let's now actually take a look at the can I use that I showed you before and test it with that example. So backface visibility. And well, backface visibility is actually a part of the CSS transforms module, okay? But here we now have a lot of information, okay? So let's take a look at Safari because that's the one where it wasn't really working. And so now here we see that Safari 9 and 10 are reported to still require a prefix for the related backface visibility property. Okay, and it actually shows down here as well. So it needs a prefix in order to work. Okay, so let's add that. So the card, and where do we have that? Backface visibility, it's probably somewhere more up there. And yeah, here it is. That should be the one. And as always, we put the prefix version before the original version. So WebKit is for Safari. And so let's now take a look again at Safari. And so here we go. Now it's working just fine. And still, of course, this white and blurred background, which looks really cool. Now, of course, backdrop filter can be other things. It doesn't have to be just a blur. So let's inspect this here and inspect on Safari actually only works if you first enable that option. And I think that's in the definitions in case you're using a Mac. So you have to click here, Show Develop menu in the menu bar, and then it's gonna appear up there. Okay, and then you can make the inspect. So again, right now it only works on Safari, but in the future, I'm sure it will come to Google Chrome as well and all the other browsers. And so even if you don't have Safari installed on your computer right now, it's still good to learn this even at this point. So we can add something else here like brightness, right? So remember we used filters before, but the difference was that the filter was applied to the element itself, while in this case, it's just applied to the element that's behind. So brightness, for example, let's say 200% here or something, and then the background will become really bright. You see it here in these colors, or you can make it dark as well, like 20%, and then it becomes really dark. We can use something crazy like invert, for example. Then it will invert all the colors that is behind the element, so it looks crazy like this. Okay, I don't know when that will ever be useful, but it still exists. So there's a lot of different values for the backdrop filter. So with sepia here, it would look like this. So the sepia colors applied to the back. And yeah, if you want to experiment more with this, then feel free to do that now. So taking now a look at the rest of the web page, I think that everything is working just fine here. I don't really have an older version of Safari to test, but at least in this version, everything is going just fine. What I do have though is an older version of Firefox. Okay, and so let's open that, Firefox. And it actually says here, well, in Portuguese, that there's a new version available, 55, but I don't want to do that right now because I actually want this older version. So let's copy the URL here to Safari. And again, you see our orange version. And now actually in Safari, it wasn't orange, right? So something wrong was going on there. Let's open that up again. So you see that it's green here, and that shouldn't be like that, right? Because in Safari, it is orange, which means that it's the large hero image. Remember from the last lecture. And in Chrome, it's also that, but in Safari right now, it's not. And that means that something wrong is going on here, and so we should fix that. And the problem is actually in here, in this media query. So Safari doesn't support this part here, okay? So that's something that I should have done in the last lecture, where we talked about responsive images in CSS, but I didn't really think of it, and so I'm doing it now. So it's really important that we do this, because otherwise this entire logic here is not going to work on Safari, neither the desktop version nor the mobile version, which is really important because most people use Safari on their iPhones or their iPads. So we had to add another line here. So just copy this one. Put it back here again. All right, so that's the part here that doesn't work in Safari, but we have something that we can use instead of this, and which does work in Safari, and that is called WebKit min device pixel ratio should be 2. So that's a big property. So basically what this means is that the pixel ratio of the device should be at least 2. And what this 2 means is basically the 2x that I've been explaining to you, okay? So if the screen is at least 2x, because there's also 3x or maybe even more, but anyway, if it's at least 2x, which is really the same as having this resolution here at least, well then this code here should apply. Okay, and so we had 2 conditions here with the or, and now we have 3. So if this one happens, or if this one happens, which is only going to happen on Safari, and now the comma, or if the min width is 125, then apply the bigger hero image. So let's take a look at that now in Safari, and voila, now it works. Okay, let's decrease that, and so it disappears at 600 pixels. Okay, so now we're ready to put it back at the primary green color. Okay. And so now it should work just as intended. So close it, and let's get back to the older version of Firefox. And what you see here right away is that the clip path that we've been using is not really working here, right? And it's not working here. It's not working down here. And it's also not working here. And here it's actually causing a major problem. Okay? So in all the places where we used the clip path property, it's not really working. So let me fix that right here in the header. And actually there's not much to fix, but still, just to show you how we can do it, I'm gonna do some changes here anyway. So let's close all of this, the card as well, and then back to the header. So what do we want to happen with the header when clip path is not supported? Well, I would say that in this case, the entire header doesn't have to be all of this high, okay? It could be a lot smaller. So let's write a feature query here. So support, and then we need the clip path property. And again, we actually need to specify a value for the property. So polygon, and now it doesn't really matter what we put here. It's really completely irrelevant. We just need to put anything. So we just put a 0, 0 coordinate. Okay, just anything, it doesn't really matter. And then or, and we want the same thing here with the WebKit prefix, just as I did before, okay? So WebKit clip path. So, and if this is supported, what do we want to happen? Well, of course, this here. So the clip path property will then be applied, and only in that case we want a height of 95, as we had in the beginning. And if it's not the case, then let's just put like 85. Okay, and so that's better, so the user knows that the page actually continues after this hero section. Okay, so let's take a look at that now. And it actually already worked. So you see that it's now smaller here, and then down there, the web page continues. And if you put this even smaller, like 80 view H, then you would see, well, it would be maybe a bit too much, but you get my point anyway, right? So this works, and that's what we really want to prove. Just to show you that in Safari here, even if we reload this, it still works the exact same way as before. So clip path is supported, and then all of this code here gets applied, and the height of 95 overrides the height of 85, obviously. Now, what was causing greater problems in Safari was actually down here, right? So let's just come up with a quick fix for that. So the test that we're going to write is basically the same as this, and then it is in the story component, okay? And so what element is that actually which causes us the problem? And it's this one here, it's the shape, right? So let's include our feature query right here. And of course, we don't want this to happen, but what we want to happen is of course here this clip path. Okay, so we remove it from there and put it here. And so only if it's supported, it gets applied. And also only in this case, it needs to be this big, because as you saw, that image was way too big, right? So let's take a look at that now. And well, it actually looks the same. And I believe I know why this is happening, because actually it's the image that's causing the problem, right? So even if the shape has this 15 rem height or width, the image that's in there still overlaps this element. So what we can do here is to say overflow hidden. Okay, so let's take a look at that now. And actually we can remove this part from here. And all right, so that's better, right? So let me explain that again. So before we had this huge image here. So inspect the element. This is all in Portuguese here now, but that shouldn't be a big problem. So story shape. And so yeah, that was the problem. And so the overflow hidden here, what it does is that basically it cuts out the part of the image which is overflowing, which is bigger than this element. Because you see this element has only this size, so inside of these blue lines, but the image, as you see, was a lot bigger. But if we use overflow hidden, then that hides that outside part. Now what you also see here is that the shape outside property is not known to Safari, so of course it's also not being applied here. Which was the reason why we actually used this clip path here and all of that stuff in the first place, right? So we can also put that one here in the feature query. Doesn't really change the functionality, but at least then Firefox is not trying to understand what's going on here, right? Now just to make this round, we can try border radius of 50%. And so now it's actually also round. So it looks actually similar to the way that it looked before. The only difference is that now it's not flowing here on this round side here outside of that circle, right? And so what we need to do in here is border radius and none. So if the clip path is actually supported, then that border radius shouldn't be 50%. It shouldn't simply exist. Okay, so let's take a look at that now in Google Chrome after reloading. And so it looks still fine in here. Of course, the text is flowing around that. And so, yeah, everything is good here. Everything is good on this older version of Firefox. So you still see some difference. Like, for example, this here is showing while on Google Chrome it's not, but that's not a problem, okay? It doesn't make any difference. So everything still works the same. This red border here is just the default functionality of Firefox when a field is not correct, but that's not a problem as well. And so, yeah, it works at least on this version of Firefox. So let me close that one as well. And now we could, of course, continue doing that for all the different properties that may not be really well supported by the older browsers. So for example, we could take a look at the one that we used here. So the background clip property here that we used. So maybe that one is also not supported on some of the not so modern browsers. And so you could check for that and then simply make the text, for example, just green if background clip is not supported. Okay. Right now I don't have any other browsers here to test, and so I'm not going to do that. But once again, such as I've been doing in this section now, is that I'm going to leave that as a challenge for you. Okay, so now armed with this knowledge about the feature queries and the Can I Use tool here, which is really useful, you can now go ahead and take a look at these modern features that I showed you and then try to implement a graceful degradations for older browsers for each of these properties. All right, this was just another really fun lecture, really important as well with the feature queries, and also a really great new property that I showed you, which allows for this really cool background blur. And I'm sure that you can have a lot of ideas on where to implement and use that one. So I hope that you take that challenge now, implement some more feature queries, and then I see you in the next lecture. So over these last lectures, I promised that I would show you some more stuff that you can do with NPM packages and NPM scripts, right? Like automatically adding prefixes to some properties or compressing code. And so that's what we're going to do in this lecture. We are going to build something developers call a build process. And what is a build process? Well, it's basically just a sequence of tasks that we perform automatically after we finish developing a product or a certain feature of a product. And the result of the build process are one or more final files, which are then ready for production, which means basically ready to be deployed to a web server. So what you see here is the very simple build process that we're going to implement in a second. We just start with our main SASS file and then of course compile it to a CSS file, as we've been doing all this time. Then we want to merge the content of the CSS file with the CSS in the icon font file, so that we can go from including 2 CSS files in our page to only 1, which is a lot better. And that process is called concatenation. Then from there, we want to automatically add prefixes to our code, right? And so that's the next step in the build process. And then finally, the last step is to compress the entire code we have at this stage. And that's it. Just 4 simple steps, nothing all too complicated. So let's now create this build process with NPM scripts. All right, and we do that right here in the package.json file. Now the first thing that I want to do is to actually change the name of the script that we already have, which is called compiled SASS, and I want to change it to watch SASS, because next I want to add a script which will compile the SASS but without watching it, okay? So it's actually pretty much the same as this. We have to add a comma here if you want to add a new one, okay? And this one I want to call compile. But as I said, without the watch part, okay? And actually I want to compile it to another file. So we go from main, of course, which is our main SASS file, and I want to call it style.comp.css, okay? So comp stands for compiled. Now right now we still have our code running in here, so let's actually close these two. So terminate, add a new tab, and then close this one. Okay, so if we now run our compile SASS script, we should actually end up with the same code as we had before, right? The only difference is that it puts that into a new file and that it's not going to watch for changes, okay? So let's just test that out. npm run compile SASS. And all right, so you saw that it finished here now, and it created the new file here as well. So style.comp.css. All right, and I'm doing that here in a different script or a different task, because these here are actually called tasks, okay? So I'm doing this in a different task because then later I want to combine all of these tasks for our build process, and then that one should of course not be watching for changes, okay? And so we want one that watches the changes, which is this one, and then we want one that we can use at the end of our project when we run the build process. So the next step is to concatenate our existing CSS files, right? So concat CSS, and of course these names that I'm using here don't have to be these exact names. So you can just call it concat or concatenation or whatever you want. I just like to use this format where we first describe what we do and then we say to what type of code it is applied. And so this case, concat. Now, how do we concatenate multiple CSS files? Well, once again, there is an npm package for that, and it's called just concat. So let's install it. So npm install concat, and then remember, we're going to save it to dev, so as a dev dependency, so that it's added to our package.json file. And so that's it. Now, how do we actually use this? Well, in case that you don't know, for example, you can usually just Google like npm concat, and usually the first result is the one that you're looking for, which will take you to npmjs.com. And so here, each npm package has its own page where you can look up how it's actually used. You can see the stats, so how many people download it. You can check out the source code on GitHub and all of that stuff. So down here you have an example. And so this here is how you use the concat package in the terminal. Okay, you could also use it from Node.js directly like this, but we're interested in the command line basically. So let's just copy this in order to make it easier for us. And then we can paste it here. So O here stands for output. And so here we can put the name of the output file that we want. And we want it to be in the CSS folder and called style.concat.css. And the input files are of course not these ones. This is just for example. So our input files are CSS icon font.css, right? And actually it's here dash, not point. So it's the icon font and then the style.comp.css. So the result of the first step, right? So CSS style.comp.css. Okay, so again, let me separate this here. Again, this is our first step where we compile our SASS file to our compiled CSS file. Then the next step is to concatenate these two files that we have, the icon font and the style from the first step, so this one here, into a new file which is called style.concat.css. Okay, and so for this concatenation, we installed a new npm package and looked up how we can actually use it. All right, so let's now test the step out. And again, in the end, we will have one global task which runs all of these at the same time. So we're not going to do them one by one in the real world. This is just for testing purposes, just to see if each of the step is actually working. So let's now try out concat CSS. So npm run concat CSS. And you see, it added a new file here. So let's take a look. And all right, so we have the content of the icon font file here, right? So all of this stuff. And then down here somewhere, yeah, so down here starts our own code, the code that we wrote. Great, so that worked. So we have now all of the CSS code in one single file, which is a lot better because like this, we only need one HTTP request instead of two when we had two files, right? Okay, next step is the prefix. So prefix CSS. And so we need yet another npm package. And this one is called npm install auto prefixer. And of course, save it as a dev dependency. So auto prefixer, yeah, I think that's right. Now, in order for the auto prefixer to work, we actually need to install another package, which is called post CSS. So npm install post CSS and then CLI, which means command line interface. So the name of this package is post CSS-CLI, and then of course save dev once more. Okay, and we need this one here because the auto prefixer is actually part of this post CSS plugin or package. Okay, so let's just wait until this installs. And so here we go. And so now the command here is actually post CSS, and then we say use auto prefixer. Okay, and so this one is a bit more complicated, and so I'm going to just show it to you instead of Googling how it works. So post CSS is the package that we use, and then we use the use option here with auto prefixer in order to actually make the auto prefix work. So next, the B option, which basically stands for browsers, and here we can specify which browsers we want to target. And the easiest options is to just say like the last X browsers. So for example, the last 5 browsers or versions actually, or whatever. And so with this here, it will target the last 5 versions of all the major browsers. And this data actually comes from the caniuse.com website that I showed you before. So it's always super up to date here. Now I like to use 10 versions here, then we can be really sure that it's going to add all the prefixes that we need, okay? So next is the input file, and that's the one from the step before. So style.concat.css, and then we specify the output parameter, so -o, and then the output that we want. So css style.prefix.css. And here I forgot the CSS part. Okay, and so now it's going to go in the CSS folder, grab the file that we outputted before, so this one here, and then write the output to the style.prefix.css file. So let's test that one out as well. So npm run prefix CSS. And all right, let's close this one here. And so style.prefix. Let's actually see how many lines this file has. Whoa, what's all of this here? Well, maybe we don't have to take a look at the number of lines. I just wanted to check out if the file is now larger than before. But we can actually see that it's added here a lot of prefixes. So like this WebKit here on all the transform properties. Okay, so you see that all of these transforms here now have the WebKit prefix. Then you will probably see, let's go up here to the animations. Here we also have it on the box shadow, the WebKit prefix. So it added these on a bunch of things. I just wanted to see the animations, but they are probably a bit more up. Here we go. So in the animations, it also should have added, yeah, here it did. So WebKit in the beginning of the add rule. okay? And so, yeah, we see that this actually worked quite well, right? Now all of this can look a bit scary, but that's not really a problem, right? Because you just have to write this once and then you can keep using it in the future. Okay, and so we actually already arrived at our last step. So compress CSS. And for this one, we actually don't need to install a new package because our node SASS package here can actually do that job. Okay? And it's very simple. We just have to write node SASS, then the input file, which is this one here. So the output from the step before, and then the output file. And I'm going to call this one simply style.css. So that will be our final file. We could also call it style.min like this, and you will usually see it as this, but I don't want to do that for one simple reason. It's because if I do that, then I would have to change in the HTML the href here as well, right? And so I would have a different one for the development phase and then a different one for the production code. And I don't want that. Well, actually what I can do here right now is to comment out this part of the code because we don't need that anymore, right? Because it's now already included in our style.css file. Now in order for this to work, we actually have to add an option here to this command, which is called output style and then compressed. Okay, and so basically with this option here, setting the output style to compressed, it will simply compress the code. There's nothing to compile from SASS to CSS because the input is already in CSS, but that's not a problem. All it's going to do here is to simply compress our code. Okay, so of course let's test that one out as well. So npm run compress CSS, and so style.css. Whoa, so that's our final code now. This is how it looks, and it's just one line of code, a huge line of code with all the code in there. So basically without all of the white space that we included and without all the comments also, of course. Let's actually compare the sizes of these, okay? Because I'm really curious now. So all the CSS files that we created here. So the input was the prefix one, right? And it had 109K. And then the compressed one, which is this style CSS, has only 33. So that's actually a big difference. So like 76K, okay? So with that very simple step, we just reduced our page load by almost 80 kilobyte, right? So that's great. Now, as I promised, I would in the end write a task that will run all of these four here at the same time. So compiling, concatenation, prefixing, and compressing. And I'm going to call that one build CSS. And so this one is going to build our CSS, which is going to be ready for production. And so how do we do that? Well, the best option in order for it to work on all platforms, so on Mac and Windows and Linux all at the same time, is to use, once again, an npm package. And this one is called npm run all. And so the name here actually says all. So we just call this package, so npm run all, and then all we have to do is to put the name of the tasks in there. So compile, concat, prefix, and compress. All right, now let's actually delete all of these files here. Okay. Except the icon font, of course, because that one we have to keep. And so let's now test this out. So npm run build CSS. All right. So you saw that it ran all of our tasks here one by one. And now it's finished. And it created all of these files here, meaning that our build process is actually working. Fantastic. That's a great job, really. That's really cool. But there's actually more that I want to show you. I want to show you another use case of this npm run all. Okay. So this is here our build process, or build workflow. Now what we also want is basically a development workflow. And we already set that up before, right? So basically as we develop, we are running this watch CSS process here, and at the same time we're running the live server process, right? So that process that makes it so that each time that we save a file, it automatically reloads the browser, right? But remember that we had to run both of these in a different command line. And so that's not really handy, right? We can do better than that. So let us first add another task called dev server. And this is just for live server. So basically dev server will be the same as the live server. But here in the step that I'm going to show you next, I cannot directly call live server. And so I have to create this task here, which I can then call. Because what I'm going to do now is a task called start. And that's a very common name that developers use for a development process. Okay. So I'm going to call start, and I want to run npm run all watch CSS and dev server. And actually let's put the dev server here before. All right, now in order to make this work, so basically that they run at the same time, I have to specify another argument, another option. And that one is simply called parallel. Okay, and that's because I want these two to run at the exact same time. While down here, I want them to run in a sequence. So first this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. And so that is different, okay? So here they have to run both at the same time, okay? And so if we now do npm run start, then it gives me this error here, okay? But I see why that is, and it's because here it's not CSS, but it's called watch SASS, right? So watch SASS here, and then of course watch SASS over there as well. So now it should run. Clear. Yeah, all right, so here we go. So we can close the previous one that we had. And so you see, if you take a look at our console now, that it's working the node says with the watch and the live server here, right? And so with one command, we basically started our development workflow. So just to test things out, let's change something. For example, let's set it here to something really huge. All right, so that's not what we want, of course, but what this means is that basically it's working, right? So it's watching our SASS file and it's running our live web server. So that is absolutely great. Now by doing that, of course, it overrode the style.css file that we outputted before, right? Because now it's created a new one. And so during development, this one here cannot be commented out because otherwise we will not be able to access the icon font, right? So you can only put this comment here, so you can only take out this entire code. So basically when you're ready to deploy it to a live web server, okay? But for now, I'm gonna leave it like this and come back to my package.json file. But actually, I think we're already done here. So we now have our development process here nicely on the top, and then our build process in here. And it works for this project, and it can work the exact same way on all your next projects. So all you have to do is to then come back here and like copy this part here of the script, copy these dev dependencies, and then you're good to go. So I hope that you found this useful, because there's really a huge value in automating all this kind of stuff. And that's what all real developers actually do in the real world. And so that's why I wanted to show you this, because I think it's really important for you. So we're almost ready with our project. There's only one lecture left to finish up our Nators project. And so don't wait and come check that one out right now. Welcome back to the last lecture of the Nators project. So it's now time to wrap it up, but before doing that, there are some small tweaks that we should make. And there are some final considerations that I want to say about this project as well. And the first very small and very subtle change that I want to do is to change the effect that happens when we select some text on the page, okay? So this is just the standard that happens, but I don't really like that. And I always like to add my own personal style and touch to these kind of small details. Okay, so we can change the style of selected text. Okay, and so let's quickly do that. And we can do so here in the base file. Okay, so down here, let's just add the selection pseudo element. So selection, and then we can simply change the background color. For example, to the primary color. So color primary. And then change the text color as well. So color, and then I think this one is called color white. Okay, and we should have our development set up still. Yeah, so it should have reloaded now. And yeah, so this looks much better, right? So whenever the user selects text now, he can see our own personal style applied to that selection. Okay, so I think that looks pretty cool. Now another small thing that I want to change or to fix is something that's considered to be a best practice, and that's in the media queries. Okay, so in here, the media queries work just fine like this, but we should actually add only screen to them. Okay, and what that does is that the media query only gets applied to screens. Okay, so this is basically the first condition, only screen, and then the max width. So for example, if someone tries to print out our page, then these media queries don't apply. Okay, so they only apply to screens. So let's just copy this into all our media queries. All right, and we actually have another one in our header, I believe. So yeah, right here. And we want this applied to all of them, right? All right, so that was another small thing that I wanted to fix. And since we're talking about media queries, there's another thing that I should show you, and that's this piece of code. And this was already in our HTML, so in the starter files that I provided for this project. But we should still not overlook this, because responsive web design does not work without having this meta element here in the HTML head. Because what this does is basically to say that our website should be rendered with the width of the device. So this is here what happens. The width of the content should be the device width. So if we have a device with 500 pixels, then our website should have a width of 500 pixels. And that's of course what we want. But if we do not specify this here in the HTML, then the browser will basically zoom out our page so that the largest possible version of our page fits the screen. So for example, if our widest element, like the row for example, has 1000 pixels, then the browser would try to render the page with a width of 1000 pixels if we didn't have this meta name viewport element in our markup, okay? So whenever you're coding a new page, don't forget to put this part in there, all right? Now another thing about media queries is something that I want to show you here, actually in the inspector, because there's still a problem going on, and that is here with the cards. So remember that for smaller screens, we put that side that was before on the back here in the front so that the user can see the button here without hovering the card, right? And that's because on mobile devices, people cannot really hover. And even if they can, it's not so easy to happen. And so maybe the user could never even see that there is a back part of this card and would then never see this button, okay? And so therefore for the smaller screens, we did it like this because we're assuming that the smaller screens are only for devices where the users cannot hover. Now imagine that we're browsing this page on a huge device like an iPad in landscape mode or like an iPad Pro. Also, whether in portrait mode or in landscape mode. So right now you see that even though we're on a touch device, we cannot see the back part, right? So the user will not hover these cards and will not see the Book Now button that's behind the cards. Because again, on a mobile touch device, users do usually not hover. And so what all of that means is that we cannot simply identify a touch device by the width of the screen alone, okay? But good news is that in CSS, we can actually write a media query which can identify if the user can hover over elements or not. And with that, we can very easily identify touch devices and non-touch devices where we have a mouse, okay? So let's very quickly implement that. And so we should go to our cart element. And so down here we have a media query. And we now want to add another condition to it. Now the problem here is that we used this respond mixin in order to write this media query. And so it's impossible to add a second condition to that media query. So what we have to do here is to actually write out the real media query. So let's get that. So tap port. So that is the media query. So I'm going to remove that or comment it out. And so this is the original media query that we had. So we want all of this to happen when the screen is smaller than 56M, right? But we also want this to happen if we have a touch device, right? And how do we do that? Well, it's actually very simple. So again, we use only screen, and all we have to say is hover none. So the card should be displayed with the back part visible when the screen is smaller than this, or whenever we're using a device where we cannot hover, which basically means whenever we have a device which uses touch as the primary input. Now, if you wanted to do this the other way around, then you could use hover and set it to hover, okay? So that's the opposite of hover none. But in this case, of course, that's what we want. And so now let's reload this entire thing, and you see that now it is actually appearing here, even on this large width, right? Now, in order to have some more control about this testing, we can add here the device type, okay? I know, of course, it's set to mobile because we're on an iPad Pro here, and so that, of course, is a mobile device. Now, if we have an iPad, for example, then it looks like this, or in portrait like this. But if you go back to responsive, then we can also set this here manually. So for example, on this huge width here, of course, this should originally be hidden. And so if we set this to desktop, then of course it's gone, right? Because now it's not a touch device. But if we set it to touch or to mobile, then it's back to looking like this. So our media query is actually working just fine. So I hope that made sense to you, okay? So let's now get out of this mode. And okay, so something else that I wanted to talk about with you is this navigation here, okay? So maybe you noticed that when we click here, then nothing really happens, right? And that's because that is something that is not really possible to implement with CSS alone. So if you wanted to really make this functional, so maybe when you click on the button, then it scrolls to the correct section and at the same time closes the navigation. So if you want all of that functionality, then you really have to use JavaScript and not CSS alone, okay? But what I wanted to show you with this is that just with CSS, we can do an amazing effect like this here, and also how to take advantage of the checkbox hack, okay? So I really wanted to show you that, even though the functionality is not 100% there, okay? Now another thing is down here. Oh, and you see that these icons here are missing, okay? And that is because in the HTML, we already removed that part right here, remember? So let's not worry about this, because once we run our build process, those icons will be back, right? So what I wanted to show you now next is this here. So everything works just fine, but the problem with this is that usually when we have a pop-up effect, when we click outside this area here, then the pop-up should also go away, right? That's the usual behavior of a pop-up, and that's not working right now. But in the real world, this should be another way of closing a pop-up. All right, so once again for that, you would probably have to use JavaScript and not rely only on CSS. But again, I wanted to show you how you can actually implement something like this in pure CSS and show you how far CSS has become and how advanced it has become in the recent years. Okay, now aside from that, I think this web page is looking really great. I hope that you did all the challenges, so you made everything really responsive, so all the background images including. And yeah, so this project should basically be ready to launch. Now just taking a last look at our code, a thing that I didn't do throughout the course was to comment my code, okay? But that's something that in real life you should absolutely do. Not only for yourself, so when you come back in the future, you still know how exactly your CSS works, but also for other developers. So imagine you write some CSS and then later someone else has to maintain that CSS, so another developer. Then in order to make his life easier, you should always comment your CSS. So you should definitely write a lot more CSS comments than I did, okay? All I did was like, say, front side styling and some other really basic comments like that. But again, when you write code in the real world, then please make sure that you write a lot of comments always. Now, another thing that we could have done in our project is to use a lot more variables. So basically all the numbers, they could simply be stored in variables. For example, all of the margins. We could have a couple of global variables here in our variable file, and then all the margins could simply depend on these variables. Or for the z-index, you could use them as variables as well. Or maybe all the font sizes. So a lot of variables could be used, and I didn't do that because I wanted to focus more on the CSS part itself and not so much on the SASS part. Okay, but still we did a lot of SASS and of architecture, and I also showed you how you could use variables for all of that. And so therefore I used variables for some of the things just to show you how it works, and then I did other stuff without the variables. Okay, so that we're not always jumping back and forth between files, and simply to make this project a bit more fun to code here in the videos. Okay, and now the very last thing before we leave this video is to actually run our build command one last time, right? So let's do that. And we can finish this process here. And on a Mac, you can do that by hitting Ctrl+C. Okay, so not Command-C, but Ctrl+C. And on Windows, I'm unfortunately not really sure. So probably just open another window, I would say, and close the one which has this process running. Okay, and the process that we want to run now is our, and let's close these, is our package JSON, and it's called build CSS. So npm run build CSS, and letting it do its thing. And all right, so let's take one last look. And now actually it's not working because we canceled the live server, okay? So we have to actually start that again. So npm run start. And so here we go. Now our icons should be back. And yeah, so right now everything is working. And so yeah, that's it. That's the project. I really hope that you enjoyed coding this project as much as I did. I think it was really a lot of fun. And a really cool, beautiful project to learn all of these new skills that you just learned. So once again, congratulations for this achievement. We've come really a long way up until this point. Now, if you want to continue, then next up, I have another very cool project where the main focus is on mastering Flexbox, which is an amazing new way of building layouts. So if you're excited about that, then let's move on together right now, right to the next section. Hope to see you over there.